Every girl dreamed of becoming a duchess. The young lady in turn was engaged to Phelan, the duke's only heir. 14 years ago, the young lady sparkled with her beauty. The family of Duke Williot earned the title of Sword of the Empire, and the young lady was lucky enough to become part of this family. The Duchess looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she had really prepared everything herself. Although the young lady came from a poor, noble family, they treated her like their own daughter. They fed her deliciously, took care of her, bought her everything she wanted. They loved her so much that their own son was even jealous. The Duchess smiled and asked the young lady to take care of their foolish son. They said they were counting on her. The young lady in turn was very happy as the Duchess taught her a lot. At the same time, the young man was seriously involved in fencing. For this reason, although they were engaged, unfortunately they rarely managed to be together, but everything was not so bad. Layla asked the young man with a smile if he had finished training. They weren't soulmates, but there was something warm about their relationship. She looked at him and asked with a smile if she had said something stupid. Layla noticed that something was wrong. She just wanted to spend more time with him. Phelan sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he was not good enough. She smiled and told him not to say such things. Layla smiled and told her fiancé that he was very smart and handsome like a duke. At that time, they joked and teased each other. The young lady was very happy when she spent time with him. But unfortunately, fate played a cruel joke on her and her smart life turned into a nightmare. She sighed heavily as she noticed that there was a strong thunderstorm. Layla hoped that the people at your estate were doing well. The maid told the mistress with a smile not to worry, as they had everything they needed. She said that she would make a beautiful duchess. The young lady looked at the maid with a smile and asked if she really thought so. The maid said with a smile that of course she thought so and she was not the only one. But a moment later they froze as they heard a scream. A man shouted that the carriage of the Duke and Duchess had overturned due to the rain. Phelan ran into the office and quickly rushed to his bride. He was in shock and screaming. The young lady in turn was trembling with shock and fear. She was very worried about the Duchess and the Duke. He tenderly reassured her and told her that she did not need to be afraid, as he was sure that his parents were fine. He hugged her tenderly and said that nothing would happen to them. The young lady in turn prayed fervently that they would return home soon. She hoped to hear the voice of the Duchess and the Duke again, but unfortunately God turned a deaf ear to her prayers. The minor Phelan lost his parents and inherited the title of Duke. He fell into despair and tried to forget himself in training. The young lady, as the future Duchess, had all the worries. In memory of the deceased Duke and Duchess, they decided to postpone the wedding. One day the Emperor declared war on another state. The young Duke, in turn, went on a campaign and returned after 6 long years. The young maid smiled and told her mistress not to worry, as she would soon meet the Duke. She looked at the lady with a smile and said that the war was finally over, and he probably missed her very much. A moment later, all the preparations were completed, and the young lady was shining with her beauty. She knew they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and she felt uneasy. She knew a lot had happened over the years, the epidemic, the bad year, but fortunately they had gotten through it all. The young lady was very glad that her fiancé had returned home. She wondered how much he had changed. A moment later, the maid called out to the young lady that she could come out. Layla was taken aback and threw all her thoughts away and boldly walked towards the exit. She looked closely at everyone present and asked if everything was ready for the Duke's arrival, as he would be arriving any minute. A moment later, the young lady stood at the entrance to the estate with all the servants. She knew that now their feelings would flare up again and now he would take her as his wife. She knew that everything would change when he returned. The young lady looked into the distance with an embarrassed smile. She was very glad that he was returning. But a moment later her face changed and she froze in place in shock. Layla saw his serious and menacing face as well as the woman who hung on his neck. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand why he came back with some woman. She was in shock because she realized that her fiancé, whom she had been waiting for many years, was now holding another woman in his arms. Layla was taken aback and wondered why she was even staring at him. She saw sparkling blonde curls, a refined feminine figure, delicate skin, and a slightly protruding belly. She froze in shock on the spot. All the servants began to whisper they were shocked because they saw that the lady was pregnant. They were a little puzzled and did not understand why the Duke brought a pregnant girl into the house. They said that it looked like the child was his. They couldn't understand how he could do such a thing when their mistress was standing right there. The maid shouted to her friends to be quiet. She went to her mistress and said that this could not be, and that the master would not have done something like that. The maid said that it seemed they had misunderstood something. The young lady wondered how one could understand this. She was puzzled because she didn't know what to do now that the girl was carrying his child. She wondered if she should pounce on her, grab her by the hair, and call her names. She didn't know whether she should be kind and turn a blind eye. She didn't know if she had any say in it since she wasn't even his wife. She sighed heavily because she understood that she was just his fiancé. Layla knew that she was nobody here. The young duke slowly dismounted from his horse and, sighing heavily, looked at his bride. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that they were all too silent. The young lady in turn froze in shock on the spot. She could not utter a word. He came closer to her and asked with a grin if she had really forgotten how to speak over the past few years. The young lady was taken aback in turn and said with a smile that of course it was not that simple. She was slightly surprised. The Duke looked at his bride in surprise and asked why she was so surprised. She froze in shock and wondered if he was asking because it was obvious or if he was just testing her. The young lady in turn very much hoped that if this was indeed the case, then the child might not be his. A moment later, he caught the young lady and tenderly said that she must be tired after the long journey. The young lady looked at the Duke with a tender smile. A moment later, he tenderly embraced her, and they went into the house. Everyone present was in shock. They did not understand why the gentleman acted in such a way. They hoped that he would not abandon the lady. She sighed heavily as she knew that unfortunately there was no way to stop the rumors. She knew that theirs was a marriage of convenience, but she still wondered if it was really possible to act like that. A moment later, the Duke turned and called for the maid. She looked at him in surprise and said that she was listening to him. He looked at the young lady with his soft smile and said that she must be very tired. He suggested that she go and rest. He also asked with a smile what room she wanted. She smiled and said that she would like the room with more light. The Duke looked closely at the maid and told her to take the young lady to the farthest room in the eastern corridor. Layla in turn froze in shock. She was puzzled as she knew that this room belonged to the late Duchess. She understood perfectly well that no one should be allowed in there. She shouted to her fiancé that that room belonged to his mother. He looked at her in surprise and asked what was wrong with that. The young lady was furious because she thought he might not understand. She looked at him intently and said that no one was allowed in the Duchess's room except the Duchess herself. He looked at her in surprise and said that his father often stayed there and so did she. She looked at him and said that the Duke was the owner of the house and she only worked there. She did not live there. Phelan looked at her intently and said that it was the same bright room in the mansion. The young lady said that there was enough light in the other rooms too. He looked at her with fury and said that they were going to listen to her complaints about him taking an empty room. He said with fury that he had straightened out the mansion that his master was established. He told the maid to take care of the young lady. The maid glanced sideways at Layla, who in turn gave her approval for this order. The young lady and her maid walked slowly into the room. Cecile turned around and looked at the young lady with a smirk. The Duke glanced sideways at his bride and called her. He looked at her intently and asked if she was angry. She didn't answer him. A moment later, she sighed heavily and gritted her teeth and said that it wasn't so. She said that everything was fine. She was in shock because her fiancé had finally returned after a long war and had settled some girl in the Duchess's room. The young lady sighed heavily as a lot had been going on with her lately. Michelle looked closely at the lady and asked if she was okay. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was fine and there was no need to pay attention. She understood that if she had told the truth, nothing would have changed. She was very prepared for his return, and he unfortunately brought another with him. She wanted to forget about everything and just lock herself in the room. The young lady told the maid that they had to go and get ready for dinner and asked her to show them the guest to his room. The lady told her maid to report to her if she noticed anything suspicious. She knew that in her position she couldn't just turn a blind eye to everything. Some time later, the young lady was sitting in the office and carefully examining all the documents. She sighed heavily as she had been doing all the Duke's work for a long time now, and due to the Duke's arrival, she had not had time to finish the accounting. Even those who had thrown mud at her behind her back for deciding everything in the Duke's name now accepted it as a given, but she knew that they would not forgive mistakes. For this reason, she tried her best to do everything perfectly. She carefully checked every document to make sure that she did not make any mistakes. The young lady wanted to check one more document and finish it, but suddenly she was taken aback as she heard thunder and lightning outside the window. She was in shock because she was so immersed in her work that she forgot about the heavy rain. Since that day, she panics whenever she hears the sound of a thunderstorm. The young lady was never able to recover from the death of her loved ones. She wondered if her fiancé remembered this. She sighed heavily because she knew that he probably forgot how it felt for her. She knew that this was the reason he had let that girl into the Duchess's room, but he asked her whether she was angry or not. The maid looked intently at her mistress and said that it was time for dinner. Layla smiled and asked the maid for forgiveness as she had been working a little too hard. She said that the Duke had returned home and they should have dinner together. The young lady knew that this was how families did things, although when she looked at him, she couldn't even swallow a bite. The maid sighed heavily and said that they were all glad that the Duke had returned, but she told her mistress that she did not need to bother herself for that lady. The young lady knew that her maid was angry, like a little child, and it was very funny Michelle was her favorite maid. A moment later, they froze in place as they saw the commotion. The young lady said with a smile that with the Duke's return, the estate had come to life again. She saw that everyone was very busy and did not want to disturb them. A moment later, the maid greeted the young lady. Layla was taken aback when she saw the maid. She looked at her with bewilderment. A moment later, the young lady told the maid to stop. She asked the maid where she was taking the food. The maid was taken aback and, trembling with fear, said that the Duke had asked for dinner to be taken to his room as he had said that he was too tired. Michelle froze in shock, and Layla in turn also froze for a moment. She wondered whether she was still a member of the family or not. She understood perfectly well that the Duke and Duchess treated her like their own daughter, but now that didn't mean anything. She had worked at the Duke's estate for a very long time, but still remained an outsider to them. She knew that since she was not a member of the family, she could not demand that the Duke come out to dinner with her. She sighed heavily, as she understood perfectly well that others understood everything as well. The young lady looked at the maid and said that there was too much food on the cart for one Duke. The maid hesitated, not knowing what to answer, since she felt uncomfortable saying something like that. The young lady in turn froze in shock, as she now realized that he had decided to have dinner with his guests. She was furious and couldn't believe how he could do something like that. Michelle called the lady, but she didn't answer. The butler entered the young lady's office and said that he urgently needed her to sign a document. He said that knowing that it was the Duke's duty, but that she had to understand everything herself, Layla said that from that day on the paperwork would be handled by the Duke himself. The young lady in turn lay quietly in the bathtub and enjoyed the warm water. But a moment later she was again lost in her thoughts, not knowing what to do. The butler slowly handed the documents to the young lady and said that they needed to be signed urgently. He stood quietly and waited for her verdict. She knew that the Duke was at the estate and he should be directly dealing with the documents. She was furious because she knew that he was probably relaxing and having fun with that girl. Layla handed the documents to the butler and said that from that day on the Duke should handle all the documents. She looked at him intently and said that since the Duke had returned from the war, it was now his responsibility. The man was a little puzzled. He had worked for the Duke for half his life, but now he absolutely did not understand anything since the lady asked him to pass the documents to the Duke. He was puzzled as he was not sure that the Duke would be able to understand such documents. The Duke looked at the butler in surprise and asked why he had brought him the documents since Layla should deal with such things. The butler said that while the master was away, she took on all the duties. The Duke shouted that she did this before he went to war. He thought to himself with a smile that this was all the young lady's doing. He understood that they had not seen each other for a long time, and now she was looking for a reason to meet. The young lady left the room and called the Duke. She said that she was very bored and also asked when they would finish speaking. He said with a smile that she should not forget that she was pregnant and therefore she should not overexert herself. The butler froze in shock. The Duke looked at the butler and told him to have the young lady's papers from him as she was simply angry. He said that she should deal with them today. The Duke looked at the butler with fury and said that it was his order. Cecile looked at him intently and asked with a smile if Layla was really his fiancée. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was indeed so. She looked at him intently and said that they seemed to be very close, since they called each other by their first names, even without a title. She said that the young lady was obviously very dear to him. He smiled and said that they had been together since childhood. She looked at him in surprise and asked if such familiarity was really allowed. She said that he was after all a duke, and she was only the daughter of a count. She smiled and said that of course the young lady was his fiancé, but in the eyes of the nobility that did not change anything. She lay down on the Duke's shoulder with a smile and said that she had better address him properly. She looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that otherwise the others would look down on him. The butler looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes as he brought her the documents. She sighed heavily and told him to hand over the documents to her. She knew perfectly well that the Duke had refused to deal with the documents as she had expected. She knew he had never done anything like that before, but she knew they were part of his family, and she couldn't do his work for him forever. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew she needed to talk to the Duke. She wondered if she should bring up the subject of his visit. The young lady sighed heavily. The butler looked at her with puzzlement and asked if she was okay. Layla looked at him with a smile and said that she was okay. But unfortunately, moments later, she froze in place from shock. With trembling hands, she handed the documents to the butler. She looked at him intently and said that if he didn't need anything else, he could rest. He smiled and wished her good night. Some time later, her lady was left alone in the room. She was shaking with fear, and she was in panic because unfortunately there was a thunderstorm outside the window again. Trembling with fear, she reassured herself. She told herself that she had nothing to be afraid of since it was only thunder. Out of fear, she lay on the bed and covered herself with a pillow. She was very depressed and wished that Michelle was next to her. Her faithful servant always helped her and calmed her down. Michelle spoke with a tender smile about her mistress, saying that she would never abandon her and would always be by her side. Thunder struck and the young lady moved closer to the Duke. He hugged her with a gentle smile and asked if she was afraid of thunder. The young lady with tears in her eyes said that she was a little afraid. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that in that case he could not do anything and must stay with her today. She smiled and said that she was very glad about that. The maid in turn looked to the side and called the master. He looked at her with fury and asked if she was still there. She asked if she could leave. He allowed her to leave the room. A moment later, the young lady told the Duke that her back and legs were very painful. He asked if he should send a doctor. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that there was no need to do that a massage would just help her. Michelle sighed heavily and said that she didn't know how to do massage at all, and it would be better for her to go to the mistress. The Duke looked at the maid with fury and told her to give the young lady a massage immediately. At the same time, Layla was writhing in fear in her bed while a thunderstorm raged outside the window. The Duke at the same time was looking intently out the window with a glass of wine in his hands. The young lady in turn was taken aback and turned around as she heard some noise. She looked at the Duke in surprise as she did not expect to see him. He looked at her intently and said that he had brought a very urgent letter. The Duke looked at her and said that this was an invitation to a ball in honor of the ascension to the throne of the new emperor, and it would take place in a month. She was worried because time was very short. The journey to the capital was long, and outfits needed to be prepared. She knew she needed to contact a tailor. Layla asked the Duke how long he was going to stay in the capital. She said that if he wanted to get everything done, he needed to start preparing today. While reading the document, she said that they also needed to prepare a carriage and buy gifts. He looked at her intently and said that from that day on, she was to address him by his title. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. The Duke said that they would often appear in high society, and if she became familiar, everyone would laugh at him. He looked at her with fury and asked if she really wanted to disgrace him. Layla was taken aback because she knew that this had not bothered him before. She was in shock and did not understand what had happened. She realized that Cecile had put him up to this. She sighed heavily and said that she would call him Duke to people. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was very good. She looked at him and said that in that case he should also stop calling her by name in front of everyone. The Duke sighed heavily but still agreed with her. She said that she would call a tailor to make her an outfit especially for ball. He looked at her intently and said that in that case it was necessary to pick out dresses for Cecile. Layla froze in shock. She looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that the young lady would go with him to the capital. The Duke said that she would be completely bored here without him. The young lady was furious, but still said that he could do as he wanted. He looked at her closely and said that he hoped very much that her clothes would suit Cecile. He smiled and said that she was their guest and they had to take care of her. The young lady looked at him and asked if he still considered her the mistress of the estate. He looked at her intently and said that, of course it was, and that she was his future wife. She was furious and asked if he really had the nerve to ask her about this. He looked at her closely and said that unfortunately he had lost his temper that night and the young lady had become pregnant. He asked if that was a reason to abandon the child. He looked at her intently and said that when the girl gave birth, he would throw her away. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she would be his wife. The young lady was shocked. She understood that the child would still be written down in the family tree. Now everything was clear to her since her father had said the same thing about her. She looked at him intently and said that she understood him. She looked at him with fury and said that he should also understand her. Layla looked at the Duke and said that if he really wanted to marry her, then he shouldn't ask her to take care of Cecile. The servants whispered to each other as they noticed that the Duke and the lady had become distant from each other. They knew that they had communicated well before, and now they even addressed each other by title. They said it was all because of that woman who was pregnant. They were worried that she would give birth to a boy, and the Duke would throw out the lady and Cecile would become a duchess. The servants were taken aback because they saw the mistress. She looked at them intently. With lightning speed, they asked the lady for forgiveness. She sighed heavily and said that they should not worry and apologize. She looked at them intently and with an innocent smile said that it was all mostly true and they were right. The young people were taken aback as they did not expect such a reaction. They did not want to offend the lady at all. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that there was nothing to worry about. She understood perfectly well that she had decided to marry him not out of love. She decided to marry him in order to run away from home. Of course, it was painful for her to watch her future husband spend time with another. A moment later, she froze in place, all her thoughts flying away. She knew that if the girl stayed away from her, she wouldn't care. But suddenly, she clearly saw a young lady in front of her. Cecile greeted her with a smile. Cecile looked closely at the lady she had found and said with a smile that her belly was already big and also asked if she wanted to touch it. Layla sighed heavily and declined the offer. Cecile, with a radiant smile, apologized for not introducing herself. A moment later, she said with a radiant smile that her name was Cecile Heliot. Layla knew that the girl was from the kingdom of Mulis. Her family ruled the country that they had recently captured. She realized that in front of her was the princess of the captured kingdom. She sighed heavily as she understood that her country was no more, and now it did not matter. She wanted to leave, as she was not in the mood for conversation. Cecile addressed Layla, but in doing so, she called her Miss Tabessa. Layla froze in shock. Layla knew that before her was the nobility of a fallen kingdom that had lost its status, so she had to call her lady, not Miss. The maid was taken aback and told Cecile that for her, their mistress was a lady. Layla calmed her maid with a gesture. Michelle looked at the young lady intently and told her to remember that she was no longer a princess. Layla looked at the lady intently and said that she would like to apologize for her maid, as she was a very straightforward person. She looked at her intently and told her not to pay attention, and she addressed her simply by her name. A moment later, she apologized again and said that she had to go. The young lady sighed heavily. She was very tired of the new guest. A moment later, the maid informed her that a letter had arrived from the Countess. The young lady froze in surprise and shock as she remembered the Countess. She was surprised as she did not expect the Countess to send her a letter. She sighed heavily as she realized that she shouldn't think about such things. The Countess wrote in the letter that she missed him very much and would like to know from the young lady how she was doing, and she also reported that she would come to visit her. The young lady sighed heavily as she did not want to see her at all, but unfortunately she could not refuse. She looked closely at the maid and said that the Countess would be visiting them tomorrow. The maid was surprised as she did not expect such a thing. The young lady looked at her closely and told her not to worry, as the Countess would only be visiting them for a short time. The maid knew that they still needed to prepare. A moment later, a maid ran into their room and shouted, "Mistress!" She looked closely at the lady and said that the girl had fainted. Layla looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The maid said that a doctor had already been sent to her, and the Duke had also come to her. Layla sighed heavily and thanked the maid for telling her the news. She knew that since the Duke was already there was no need for her to go there. Layla began to tell the maids what needed to be done, but suddenly froze in shock. The Duke burst into her office, looked at her with fury, and called out. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the Duke with horror. He looked at her with fury and asked what she had done to Cecile. She asked if he was asking whether they had spoken or not. He shouted furiously at her not to pretend that she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her with fury and asked why she fainted after meeting her. He did not understand what she had said to her. The young lady was shocked. She looked at the Duke and asked if Cecile had told him that she had fainted because of her words. He shouted furiously that she had not told him anything because she was still unconscious, but the doctor believed that it was all due to severe shock. He looked at her intently and shouted angrily that the maids had said they had seen them together. She looked at him in surprise and asked if they had said that she had been rude to her. Layla calmly said that they had only said hello. She looked at him intently and asked if introducing oneself to a guest was considered rude. He grabbed her angrily and pinned her against the wall. The young lady froze in shock. She did not expect this. He shouted with cold fury that if something happened to his child, he would not forgive her. He looked at her intently and shouted that she must be more careful in the future, otherwise he would take revenge on her in the same way. The young lady trembled with fear. After the Duke left, she fell to the ground with a crash. The maids were taken aback and ran up to their mistress. She sighed heavily as she now understood everything. She was shocked because she understood that his feelings for her were much deeper than she thought. She understood perfectly well that only one could become a duchess. She knew perfectly well that her engagement would end in a breakup, not a wedding in the end. The maid looked closely at her mistress and said that the young lady had come to her senses. A moment later, Michelle said that the Countess had arrived at their estate. The young lady sighed heavily as she had not even had time to rest before the Countess arrived. She greeted the Countess with a radiant smile. The Countess looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was very glad to see her. Layla smiled and said that everything was wonderful with her. The Countess said with a smile that they could go into the living room. She glanced sideways at the maids and said that they had something to discuss and asked them if they could go out. The young lady looked at her intently and said that they would discuss everything now. Sometime later they were sitting in the living room and the young lady was slowly pouring tea. The Countess looked at her closely and said that she looked wonderful. She asked if the lady had any idea why she had come. Layla looked closely at the Countess and said that she had no time for idle chatter now and they could get down to business. The Countess sighed heavily and told the young lady that she was still the same impudent girl as before. Layla looked at her intently and asked if she had come for no reason. Layla looked at her and called her mother. The Countess angrily told her to stop calling her that. Layla sighed heavily and asked the Countess to speak faster as she was not feeling well. The Countess looked at her with fury and said that she should not behave in such a way with her since she was still Tebessa. The young lady in turn was taken aback and looked at the Countess in surprise. She looked away. He was a countess and asked why she had come. She wondered if the Countess had decided to make fun of the fact that she had never married. The Countess smiled and said that she had heard very interesting rumors. She looked at her and said that she knew about the Duke's mistress. She asked the lady if the girl was really the princess of the fallen kingdom. The young lady was taken aback and looking at the Countess asked who was reporting everything to her. The Countess shouted that it was not important, but what was important was that the girl had become pregnant before her. The Countess said that Layla should not have delayed the wedding. The Countess sighed heavily and said that the young lady, as usual, did not listen to her. A moment later, she placed a small bottle on the table. The young lady was taken aback and asked in surprise what it was. The Countess said that she had just placed a mixture on her table that would ease the course of pregnancy. A moment later, she placed another small bottle on the table and looking at the young lady said that it would help get rid of the child. She looked at the young lady intently and said that just one drop would be enough. Layla was taken aback. A moment later, she said that she had no intention of listening to this at all and asked the Countess to leave as soon as possible. The Countess looked closely at the young lady and asked what would happen to her when the young lady gave birth to a child. The Countess said that most likely the wedding would not take place, and if she did become a duchess, it would be just a title and nothing more. The Countess said that at her age it was too late to look for a groom, and after the engagement was broken, she would return home. The Countess said that she was only worried about her. The young lady was taken aback and pulled her hand away. She told the Countess to leave immediately, and she would pretend that this conversation had never happened. The Countess sighed heavily and said that she had nothing more to say, but she still intended to keep the mixture. She looked hard at the young lady and told her to make up her mind or she would lose her position. Layla was shocked. She hated the young lady, but she didn't want to kill her child. She knew that he was innocent. She understood perfectly well that the Duke was the only one to blame for everything. But still, the young lady was very worried about the girl giving birth. She did not know what would happen to her then. A moment later, all her thoughts vanished as a maid knocked on her door. The young lady was taken aback and told the maid to come in. Michelle smiled and told the lady that a tailor had come to see them. Layla was very happy. She knew that they had to leave in a few days and needed to finish their preparations as soon as possible. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she needed to deal with pressing problems. In a hurry, the young lady asked the maid to call the Duke. Michelle looked intently at the lady and said that the Duke was already waiting for her there. Layla was surprised and did not understand how he managed to get there so quickly. Michelle looked at the lady and said that the Duke was teaching Cecile how to greet guests and that they were there together now. Layla was shocked. She looked at the maid in surprise and asked, "Not the jelly?" He allowed her to meet the guests. She knew that it was the duty of the mistress of the estate to greet the guests. The butler greeted the young lady with a smile, calling her madam. She looked at him with a radiant smile and said that he didn't need to bow like that at all, and she also said that she was very glad to meet him. The young lady was shocked. She knew that such a thing was never allowed by a mistress. She did not understand how this could happen. She sighed heavily, because she understood that she herself was no better because she was not a duchess. She behaved in this way with the permission of the Duke. She understood perfectly well that there was no difference between her and the young lady. The maid looked at her mistress with concern and asked what was wrong with her. She looked at the young lady intently and said that if she wanted, she would throw the Duke's mistress out right then and there. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the maids should not do such things since the Duke had given her permission. They could not do anything about it. Layla knew perfectly well that if she threw the young lady out, she would make a fool of herself. She knew she had to go. Entering the room, she saw the Duke in all his glory. She looked at him intently and said that it looked like he was already here. The Duke greeted the young lady coldly. The tailor was taken aback and tremblingly also greeted the young lady. She looked at everyone present and said that she had received a letter and also asked if she could see the finished outfit. The tailor hesitated, not knowing how to answer her question. A moment later, he said that Madame Cecile was looking at the outfit now. Cecile looked at Miss Tebessa with a radiant smile and said that she must pass quickly. Layla looked at the young lady in shock. She was in shock and didn't understand what she was wearing. Cecile looked at the young lady in bewilderment as she did not understand what was being discussed. The Duchess looked at the lady with a radiant smile and said that of course it was too early to give her the dress, but she really wanted to see her in it. The Duchess said with a smile that it was made especially for a pregnant woman and she had put her heart and soul into it. She smiled and said that she wanted the young lady to be the most beautiful. The Duchess tenderly told the young lady that she would like to see her in this dress as soon as possible. Layla looked at the young lady with fury and asked how she dared to wear a dress that the Duchess herself had given her. Cecile hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She was trembling with fear. The Duke looked at her with fury and said that it was he who told Cecile to put it on. He asked the young lady to stop screaming. Layla looked at him with fury and asked if it was really his fault again. She didn't understand how he could take something from her things without asking permission. The Duke sighed heavily and said that she should calm down as it was only a dress. He said angrily that she had no use for it now. He said that it should be useful, not lying around somewhere. Layla was in shock. She shouted to the Duke that she kept it in the most secret place. She looked at the Duke intently and asked how he had found it in the first place. She sighed heavily and said that he couldn't have known where it was. She asked if someone had been going through her things while she was gone. She looked intently at the young lady as she trembled in fear, hiding behind the Duke. The Duke sighed heavily and told her to calm down as Cecile had to greet guests and she didn't even have anything to wear. He looked at Layla and said that if she had ordered the dress for her right away, there would have been no problems. Layla asked him in surprise if he really wanted to say that it was her fault. Cecile, with tears in her eyes, asked for forgiveness and asked them not to quarrel because of her. Falling to her knees, she said she was so sorry, as if she had taken the clothes with her, nothing would have happened. He looked at the young lady intently and said that she had nothing to apologize for. The young lady hugged the Duke and with tears in her eyes said that she was nothing but trouble. The Duke smiled softly and said that he did not want her to say such things. A moment later, the Duke ordered the servants not to stand there, but to quickly bring tea and a towel. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that Cecile was a stranger and just a pregnant lover, but she knew that it was better to be wary of her. She sighed heavily and decided to leave the room. She understood that the young lady could easily take her place. She sighed heavily and slowly headed towards the exit as she understood that she was a stranger here. For some time, everyone discussed the Duke's new mistress. They said that she was a beauty, and they also said that Layla did not give her a single dress. The maids were curious whether they would break the marriage, but they still knew that in high circles there was always a mistress and a wife. Michelle sighed heavily as she thought the girls were just gossiping. The young lady sighed heavily. She said that it was nothing to worry about, and she shouldn't have raised her voice in front of everyone. She was puzzled, and now she was more worried that they would have to go to the capital. Michelle looked at the young lady closely and said that she could easily escape. The young lady said with a smile that she had no choice and she had to go through with it. She knew perfectly well that things had gone too far. A week ago, she was at a meeting. She was told that she should hand over his duties to the Duke. The man looked at her intently and said that the Duke had already returned and that it was his job now. She sighed heavily and said that they were right, but unfortunately they had an appointment in the capital in a week. She said that she would hand over the affairs to him a little later. She looked closely at everyone present and said with a soft smile that she was sure they would help him figure it all out. The Duke looked closely at the young lady as they were already near the carriage. She sighed heavily and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The Duke looked closely at his bride and said that the young lady was not feeling well and he would go with her. Layla sighed heavily and said that he could do whatever he wanted since it didn't concern her in any way. With lightning speed, she got into the carriage. She was even glad that she would not have to look at them all this time. She looked out the window and saw young people smiling happily. She was furious because it was unbearable for her to see them. Sometime later, the coachman informed them that they had already arrived. The maid sighed heavily and said that the road had turned out to be more dangerous than she had thought. She glanced sideways at her mistress and asked if everything was all right with her. The young lady sighed heavily as the journey had been very long. She told the maid that they needed to rest. A moment later, she sighed heavily as she heard whispers behind her. Everyone was in shock, not understanding why she was alone. Everyone present looked at the Duke in surprise as he smiled radiantly at the young lady. Everyone froze in surprise and asked who the young lady really was. A moment later, they realized that she was his mistress. Layla sighed heavily as she was tired of all the talk behind her back. She told her maid to take her to the room. Sometime later, she was shown her room. The young lady slowly looked around her new room. She heard that it often rained in the capital. She looked closely at the maid and asked if she could have a room without a window. The maid was taken aback and said that only servants lived in such rooms. The lady said with a smile that in that case a room with a smaller window would be fine for her. She asked with a smile if there was one. A moment later, the maid showed the young lady the room. She smiled and said that the window was at the end of the room and it was very dark there. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if the room was too small. Layla said with a smile that everything was fine with her and thanked the maid. The maid smiled and said that in that case they would move her things. Moments later, the Duke came to her and told her that her room was on the other side. She looked at the Duke intently and said that everything was exactly so, but she liked this room better. She asked if there was anything that did not suit him. He looked at her with fury and asked if she had really decided to move closer to Cecile. The young lady looked at him with fury and asked if he really thought she cared about her. Cecile looked at the Duke with a smile and said that he did not need to be angry. He said that if she wanted, he could share the room with her. She smiled and said that she was afraid to be alone in unfamiliar places. Layla froze in shock. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said with a gentle smile that she really enjoyed spending time with him. The Duke sighed heavily and agreed with her. He looked askance at his bride with malice. Layla sighed heavily. She was left alone with her thoughts. A moment later, she told her maid that she was bored. She sighed heavily and suggested that her maid take a short walk. Michelle looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had enjoyed the walk. She smiled and said that she felt much better now. Michelle said with a joyful smile that this was very good, since the young lady had not smiled for a long time. The lady, in turn, was all in her thoughts. She thought about how to break off the engagement and what her father would say about it. She knew that she was not welcome in her own home either, but she could no longer bear this. A moment later, she heard a frantic scream from the street. The young girl screamed and begged the man to let her sister go. The young lady froze for a moment. She did not understand what was happening. A moment later, she came out into the street and shouted at the man to stop. She shouted that he had attacked the girl. He looked at the young aristocrat with fury and said that she should mind her own business. Michelle shouted angrily and insulted the young man. Layla said that she could not stand idly by and wanted to hear an explanation. He shouted angrily that he was collecting a debt because several months ago she had asked him for money and still had not returned it. The girl was in shock. She screamed that her sister took a few gold coins and now he was demanding a fortune from her. The young lady looked at them intently. She was shocked by the final amount. She began to quote the imperial law to him. He shouted furiously that he did not care at all about the imperial law. The young lady quietly told her maid to go get the guards. The man looked at her with fury as he realized that she was traveling without protection and was now boldly interfering in other people's affairs. The man shouted in his rage that he would teach her not to poke her nose into other people's business, and at the same time he took out a knife and rushed at the lady. The young lady in turn froze for a moment, as she did not expect such a thing. But at that very moment, the young man defended the young lady and knocked the knife away from the man. The young man looked at her intently and asked if she was okay. A moment later, they heard a man scream. He was very angry and again attacked them with a sword in his hand. The young man let go of the young lady and with the speed of lightning parried and responded to the man's blow. A moment later, the man fell to the ground with a thud. The young man looked at him with anger and said that if he tried to pull something else again, he didn't need to wait for the square. The man was furious. He didn't understand why he had no luck lately. Layla looked closely at the young man. She didn't know who he really was. She stared at his sharp eyes, shiny blue hair, snow-white skin, and luxurious clothes. She knew that he was not an easy man. She understood perfectly well that he was a nobleman about her age, but she was confused because she did not know him. He looked at her hard and said that she shouldn't have acted so recklessly. Layla looked at him hard and said that it wasn't like that at all. He sighed heavily and looking at the young lady said that if he had not come to her aid, she could have been seriously hurt. She sighed heavily and looking into his eyes said that she thought he was very much mistaken. He looked at her in surprise and asked why. Layla sighed heavily and said that she could stand up for herself, and she struck back at the young man. He froze in shock. He was surprised because he noticed that there was a knife hidden in her fan. The maid in turn looked at the young lady with admiration. The young man smiled and said that it seemed he had indeed made a mistake. He smiled and asked for forgiveness for being so rude. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't need his apology at all, but she still thanked him for saving her. She smiled and said that he saved her and he had nothing to apologize for. He smiled and said that it was just a trifle. He smiled and said that her fan still struck him as a very useful thing. He asked with a smile if she could tell him where she had bought such a thing. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't buy it anywhere because she made it herself. When the previous duke died, there was no one to protect her, and when the current duke went to war, assassins became her frequent guests. Layla looked at the young man intently and said that she knew perfectly well that it was not proper for a lady to carry such a thing, but she had no choice. He looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and said that it was simply incredible. He was surprised that she made such a weapon herself. The young man said with a smile that it was simply amazing. She froze in surprise as he was the first person who had ever said such a thing. She knew that her fiancé had never said such a thing to her. The young lady was taken aback and wondered what she was thinking about. She knew that she should not compare her fiancé to another man. She hesitated and a moment later said that it was time for her to go. She looked closely at the maid and said that she was busy with the shawl and also said that she needed to contact the guards. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to report the man to the guards. She sighed heavily and said that this was exactly the case since the man had exceeded the interest rate and would be fined at least 1,000 gold pieces. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said goodbye to him with a smile. The young man smiled and also said goodbye to her. He stared after the young lady as she slowly walked away. The maid with a sweet smile told her mistress that the young man was simply handsome. She praised his beautiful hair. She said with a smile about her mistress that when she becomes a duchess, she will be the same. The young lady sighed heavily before she was sure that she would definitely become a duchess, but now she just hoped for it. Some time later they came to the man's office. He casually greeted them and asked why they had come to see him. Layla sighed heavily and said that she had witnessed a crime and wanted to report it. The man casually handed her a form to fill out a document. He said they could fill it out and leave. She sighed heavily and asked if he wanted to increase patrols. She said a gunman had attacked a woman. The man casually apologized and said that they were unfortunately short-handed and should just fill out the form. The maid was furious. She did not understand how he could say such a thing. The young lady looked at him intently and agreed. She said that since the captain of the guard was so cold and negligent in his duties, then they would have to turn to His Majesty for help. The man was taken aback when he heard what she said. With lightning speed, he stood up and said that she had simply misunderstood him. He said that she should fill out a form and they would get to work right away. Michelle sighed heavily and said that it seemed that in the capital, they didn't understand anything the first time. Layla sighed heavily and said that there was nothing they could do and it was time for them to go back. Michelle smiled and agreed with the lady. A moment later, the young lady heard footsteps behind her. She sighed heavily and said that the capital was not safe and it was already dark. A moment later, she froze in place as she distinctly heard someone following them. With the speed of lightning, she turned around and looking at the young man asked why he was following her. He apologized to her with a smile and asked if he had scared her. The young man, with an innocent smile, said that he just wanted to ask something. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he wanted. He smiled and said that he would like to talk about what happened this morning. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew that the man had received 60% of the share. She looked at him in surprise as she had not expected to hear such a question. Layla looked at him intently and asked if that was all he needed. He sighed heavily and said that of course not, because he was wondering how she knew that the empire's interest rate on small businesses was 30%. He was surprised and did not understand how she found out that the criminal would have to pay about 1,000 gold pieces. She said with a smile that it probably seemed strange to him that she knew this. He sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly so, since usually noble ladies were not taught such things. She knew that this was true because women did not rule the land, so learning the laws was useless, but the young lady had to rule the land while the Duke was at war. She sighed heavily and said that she was simply curious to know. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really thought that a woman could not study such things. The young man was taken aback and said that, of course, that was not so. He looked at her closely and said with a beaming smile that he was simply surprised since most people didn't even think about it. She sighed heavily and said that if that was all, then she was leaving. He looked after her with a smile and said that he looked forward to their next meeting while he called her Lady Layla Tabessa. The young lady, in turn, froze in place from the silk as he recognized her true identity. She turned around and asked excitedly how he knew her name. She froze in surprise on the spot as she saw that the young man was not there. The maid sighed heavily and told the young lady that it seemed he recognized her by the mark on her fan, and besides, she was very famous among high society. Michelle said that it was not surprising that the master recognized her. Layla asked the maid if she knew what family the man was from. The maid sighed heavily and said that she did not know who he really was, and also asked the mistress if she should find out more about him. She sighed heavily and said that there was no need for that. He seemed to her not at all like a simple nobleman. She thought that she would definitely meet at the coronation of the emperor. Sometime later, she was informed that the Duke had arrived. She looked at the Duke in surprise as he greeted her with a smile, calling her by name. She looked at him intently and said that he could no longer call her by just her name and must address her as a lady. He looked at her closely and said that he had thought that the lady's life was not at all sweet. The Duke asked if she was really happy with all this. She sighed heavily and said that she was simply keeping her promise. He sighed heavily and said that she should stop talking like that as his head was already hurting from such chatter. The young man looked at her intently and said with a radiant smile that it was a lot of fun to talk to her. He smiled and said that she knew a lot of things, and he also wished he could be that smart. She sighed heavily as he had said something like that before. The Duke leaned closer to her and asked if she was really crying now. She sighed heavily, and looking away from him said that everything was not so simple. Dust got into her eyes. The Duke, with a beaming smile, asked her if she would like to try some chocolate cake. He smiled and said that he didn't understand women's tastes, so the store owner helped him with his choice. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really brought her a chocolate cake. He handed her the box and said that he had simply remembered that Cecil really wanted something sweet. The young lady was taken aback and froze in place in surprise. He was taken aback and asked what had happened as he saw that her face had darkened. She sighed heavily and said with tears in her eyes that it seemed like he wasn't for her. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she really liked sweets. He sighed heavily and said that if that was the case, then she could always buy it for herself. The young lady stood there dumbfounded as she had not expected to hear such a thing from him. Cecil greeted the Duke with delight and asked with a smile if he had really brought chocolate cake. The Duke smiled and said that it was all so, and he also said that she should eat since he was all for her. The young lady enjoyed every piece of cake with a smile. Looking at the Duke, she asked where he found such a sweet treat. He smiled and said that he asked a friend where they sell delicious cakes. She looked at him intently and with a radiant smile asked if she could have more like this as she loved sweets very much. He smiled and said that she could eat as much as she wanted. She looked at him intently and asked if he had brought the lady a cake too. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she was asking. She sighed heavily and said that she was ashamed to eat such a delicious cake alone, and in her homeland they always shared delicious food with loved ones. She looked at him intently and with a radiant smile said that Lady Layla was like a real family to her now. The maid looked at her mistress with a radiant smile and said that the master had given her the cake. She sighed heavily and said that if he did that, then something clearly happened. She knew perfectly well that the Duke had never cared for her without reason. She looked closely at the box as she knew that it was the same as the one intended for Cecil. She had some kind of unpleasant feeling. It seemed to her as if she had forced him to do it. The maid said with a smile that she knew that her mistress did not like cakes, but today she thought that she could try. The young lady said with a smile that she was probably right, and to be honest, she had been really craving something sweet lately. After she opened the box, she froze in place in shock and confusion. The maid was in shock. She didn't understand what it was, they just saw it. The young lady in turn was furious as she realized that the Duke had brought her the remains of the cake. The maid, trembling, came closer to her mistress and called her. The young lady in turn stood quietly in a daze. The butler timidly hesitated and said that the young lady sent it because she said that in her homeland it was customary to share delicious food. Layla turned around and ordered the servants to remove the cake immediately. She sighed heavily and wondered what she needed to do to make her heart feel better. She was in shock and did not understand who she was to the Duke. She sighed heavily because she didn't know what to do. The Countess hated her because she was the daughter of a mistress, which she realized when she saw how the Count took care of her mother. Now the young lady understood what the essence of the Countess's hatred towards her was. She knew that from then on the Countess had treated her terribly. But now the young lady was alarmed and puzzled by something completely different. She knew that despite all these humiliations, she had to continue living with the Duke. The maid looked intently at her mistress and asked with a smile if she would take on the embroidery of the scarf. Layla froze for a moment. She completely forgot about the scarf. The maid smiled and said that after all this was the Emperor's debut, and at such events men receive scarves from people they dream about. So usually ladies keep a scarf with them. The maid looked intently at her mistress and asked with a smile if she had forgotten. A moment later, the maid said that it was not surprising because the Duke had been at war, and now he was always busy. The young lady said with a smile that whatever the case she would not give up because she had embroidered the handkerchief a long time ago, but many years had passed since then. The young lady knew that it was all because the Duke had gone off to war, but she knew very well that she had to embroider him a handkerchief so that he could show it off when he returned alive. She thought for a moment and wondered what the Duke had said when she gave him that handkerchief. He asked with a smile if this was her family's coat of arms, since the embroidery was a little clumsy. Then he made fun of her with a sincere smile, and the young lady in turn said that if he didn't like it, he should return the handkerchief to her. He looked at her intently and with a gentle smile said that she did not need to worry as he would return alive. He kissed her hand tenderly and said that she just needed to wait for him. Now she remembered those times with sadness. She knew that those memories always brightened her life. She sighed heavily because she understood that no matter how much she hated him now, he remained her fiancé. She knew that she could not expose herself at the Emperor's debut. Sometime later she was embroidering a scarf. The maid brought the young lady a first aid kit with a smile and said that she had already cut herself many times. Layla sighed heavily and said that she didn't even think that knitting a scarf would be so difficult. She said with a smile that unfortunately she couldn't do much. She said that unfortunately dancing wasn't her thing. The maid smiled and told the mistress that she simply hadn't tried it before. The lady smiled and said that unfortunately you can't do everything at once. However, thanks to the efforts of the teacher, she knows the basic movements. Unfortunately, she never managed to move in rhythm. She knew it had to be done, and she had to concentrate and watch her partner. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she simply could not believe that she could not do something. Layla smiled and softly said that unfortunately everyone has their own shortcomings. She sighed heavily and said that if she had more time it would be wonderful, but she only had 1 day left. She sighed heavily and said that she would have to work all night. In the morning she was beaming with joy as she had prepared everything. The maid looked at the lady with a smile and said that her handkerchief turned out just perfect. The young lady thanked her maid as if it weren't for her, the lady would definitely not have had time. The maid said that she needed to show the handkerchief to the Duke right away. Michelle looked at the lady intently and said that she must show it to her immediately, as she had worked all night for the handkerchief. The young lady looked at her work with a smile and said that she really must show it to him. Some time later, she got ready and went to the Duke. She sighed heavily because for some reason she suddenly became embarrassed, as if she had returned to those times again. She froze for a moment when she saw the Duke leaving the room. She called him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what happened. The young lady became embarrassed, not knowing what to say. But a moment later she was taken aback and froze in place in surprise when she saw Cicely run out of the room. Cecile looked at the Duke in surprise and asked why he had thrown the handkerchief. Layla froze in shock when she saw in her hands an embroidered scarf with the coat of arms of the Herzen family. She quickly hid her box behind her back as she realized that what she was seeing now was a very skillful piece of work, especially in comparison to hers. Cecile looked at Lady Tebessa in surprise and intently. Cecile greeted the lady with a radiant smile. Cecile looked at Layla intently and said with a smile that she really hoped that she would forgive her for her impudence. She said that she knew that she couldn't embroider, so she took the liberty of preparing the scarf instead of Layla. Cecile asked with a smile if she liked it. She smiled and said that this banquet was the Duke's debut in high society, and she was worried that if he was left without a handkerchief, everyone would look at him askance. She smiled and said that for this reason, she decided to make a handkerchief for her. The young lady was taken aback and stood frozen in shock as she could not believe that Cecile had made the scarf for her. Layla wondered who she thought she was. Cecile looked at the young lady with fear and said that she did not like the look in her eyes at all. The Duke looked at his bride and said that the young lady had taken care of them and the handkerchief had come out. He told his bride that Cecile Vaux had not been obliged to do it at all. The Duke looked at her with fury and said that not only did she not thank her, but she also glared at her menacingly. He asked with fury how she could be so mean. Layla froze in place in shock. She looked at him intently, as he again showed off in front of her with an innocent look, as if he did not understand that he did something wrong. She looked at him with fury and said that she was not mean at all, he just allowed himself too much. He looked at her in surprise and asked in what sense she said such a thing. Layla said that the young lady could carry his child, but she was just his mistress, and he couldn't proudly show her off to everyone, and she had to stay in the shadows and keep a low profile for the rest of her days. Cecile froze in shock. A moment later she felt ill, and the Duke rushed quickly to her. He looked at his bride with fury and called her. Layla looked at him with fury and asked if she should indulge the young lady while she questioned her authority. The Duke was shocked. He shouted that this was not true at all, and the young lady only wanted to help them. Layla looked at him intently and said that help that is not asked for is often not needed. The Duke shouted in anger and called for his bride. She sighed heavily as she understood that they were now arguing over their mistress. She knew that it was indecent to behave like that in public. She sighed heavily and said that if the Duke wanted to take her handkerchief to the banquet, he could do so. She looked at him intently and said that he should not tell anyone who had actually left him, since she did not want to deal with a barrage of awkward questions. She looked at the Duke intently because she understood that he had finally become ashamed, and he did not even have anything to say to her in response. A moment later, the young lady turned and walked towards the exit. The maid called her, but the note did not answer. With lightning speed, the young lady walked towards the coachman. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to see her. He looked at the young lady in surprise and helped her into the carriage. She sighed heavily and said that they could go. The young man looked at her in surprise, as he knew that this carriage belonged to the Duke. She sighed heavily and said that there was nothing to worry about, as he could find another one. She said angrily that it was not the only carriage, so they could go. She sighed heavily and said that he must take her somewhere quiet. She was puzzled and also furious because the young lady had pricked her hands all over while embroidering the handkerchief. She was in shock and wondered what she had hoped for. She sighed heavily as she realized that she was a fool after all. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and asked him to forgive her for everything. He sighed heavily and said that she did not need to worry at all, since nothing terrible had happened. He asked if he should call someone for a doctor. She sighed heavily and said that there was no need to do that. The young lady leaned closer to the Duke with a smile and said that she would very much like him to stay with her. She sighed heavily and said that he was very angry with his fiancé, but it was her fault. He sighed heavily and said excitedly that she had done nothing wrong at all. The Duke said his fiancé had always been like that. He said that if she thought her authority was being threatened, she would immediately fly into a rage. He looked at the young lady closely and said that he had really hoped that this would change with time, but it seemed that her character had only gotten worse. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she didn't need anyone's recognition at all, since she was only worried about the child. The Duke said that she didn't need to worry about anything, since he wanted to include the child in his family tree as the firstborn. He told the young lady that his bride as an adoptive mother would have to take care of his child. Cecile looked at the Duke intently and asked excitedly, what if the young lady did not want to do this? He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really told her anything. Cecile said with tears in her eyes that it was not that. She said excitedly that it was just that after today she was very afraid that the young lady would run away from her child. The Duke looked at her closely and said that she should not worry at all, as it was the Duchess's duty to look after the Duke's children. He looked at the young lady intently and said that if his bride could not handle her duties, then she had no place here. She looked at the Duke intently, for she knew that everything was going according to her plan. The Duke said with a smile that he wished his child would be born soon as he was sure that he would be a good father. The young lady smiled and said that it was true. Layla sat quietly near the tree. She was puzzled and did not know what to do next. She wondered if it was true that she would never be able to belong to that house. A moment later she was taken aback and froze in surprise as she realized that someone had blocked her light. She raised her head in surprise and saw a small scarf in front of her. She froze in surprise when she saw a young man in front of her. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was sitting alone and crying. She sighed heavily and looked intently at the young man. She realized that this was the same knight who had recently saved her. She was in shock because she knew she couldn't let anyone show up like that. A moment later, she was wiping away her tears with a smile. He stopped her with a smile and said that she needed to be careful with her eyes. He slowly began to wipe away her tears. The young lady in turn thanked him shyly, but also said that she could handle everything herself. A moment later he sat down next to her and said with a smile that this place was very quiet. He smiled and asked if she liked being alone. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't, but that she needed it now. Layla sighed heavily and said that there was nothing special about it. He looked at her in surprise and asked what had upset her so much. She looked at him with a smile and asked if she told him he would help her. The young man looked at her intently and said that he would do everything in his power. She sighed heavily and thanked him for his kind words. He looked at her intently and said that he was truly willing to help her. She sat quietly next to him, and she even felt awkward since she did not expect to meet him in such a place. She saw that the hilt on his sword was very worn. She realized that he clearly knew how to fight, and it seemed that the sword was not only for defense. She remembered that her fiancé's handle was also worn out. The young man called her with a smile. She slowly turned around, looking at him, and froze in shock on the spot. The young man with the speed of lightning put a candy in her mouth. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was really a strawberry candy. He smiled and said that it was, and he always ate them when he was sad. He looked at her closely and said with a beaming smile that he really hoped she felt at least a little better. She looked at him with an embarrassed smile and a moment later thanked him. He sighed heavily and said that there was nothing to thank him for, and also turned his gaze to the box. He asked what it was she had. She was taken aback because she didn't want to show it to him at all, and with the speed of lightning she took the box. But unfortunately it happened that the contents of the box fell to the ground. The young lady hesitated and froze in embarrassment. She did not know how to explain this. He quickly picked up the handkerchief and looked at it closely. He said that the handkerchief was quite simple. The lady embarrassedly asked the young man to return the handkerchief to her. A moment later he noticed a coat of arms on the handkerchief. Looking at it, he asked if the handkerchief was meant for her fiancé. She sighed heavily and said that it was not so and she was going to throw it away. She asked the knight to give her the handkerchief. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was throwing away such a good scarf. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer, but she knew that she had to throw it away since she no longer needed it. The young man looked at her in surprise as he noticed her hands were damaged from sewing. He looked at her intently and said that he would like to take the handkerchief for himself. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect such a thing. She sighed heavily and said that he was talking nonsense since the scarf had not even turned out well. She did not understand why he needed it. He looked at her in surprise, asked why it had not turned out well. He smiled and said that she had worked hard on it. The young lady was taken aback and said in a hurry that the embroidery had not turned out at all. The young man looked at her intently and said with a soft smile that he liked the finished work. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really telling the truth. He smiled and said that his eyes had never deceived him before. A moment later, he kissed her wounded hands with tenderness and care. He looked at her intently and said that she should not judge by appearances, and in fact, he was not some idiot, and he understood the true value of things. The young lady was taken aback and embarrassedly said that she had not thought anything like that. He looked at the young lady with a smile and quickly hid the handkerchief. Layla sighed heavily and looked at the young man intently. She knew she was going to throw the scarf away, so it didn't make any difference now. She was puzzled and thought that it would be better if he served someone who really needed him. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he still had a question for her. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he could not sort out the taxes. The young man told the young lady that he hoped that she would not refuse to help him. She looked at him in surprise and said that it would be better for him to contact the official in charge of this. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he did so, but he did not say anything useful. She was surprised since he asked her lady to help with what the civil servant could not cope with. She sighed heavily and said with embarrassment that she did not know at all whether she could suggest anything to him. She was puzzled since he seemed very strange to her. The young man said with a smile that she did not need to worry at all, since he just wanted to know her opinion. She looked at him intently and asked what the problem was. Then, he looked at her with a smile and started telling her about the problem. The young man looked at her intently and thanked her with a smile. He said that she had helped him a lot. She smiled and said that she had nothing to thank her for at all, and it was very nice to talk to him. She was very happy because she hadn't communicated with anyone so easily for a long time. He smiled and said that they had a good conversation. Layla smiled and supported him. She was glad that he thought the same. The young lady looked at the young man intently. She just realized that she didn't even know his name. She looked at him intently and, asking for forgiveness, asked if she could know his name. He looked at her in surprise and, with a satisfied grin, asked if she really wanted to know his name. He smiled and asked if she was really that interested. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that in that case it could only give his name. Layla looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that. He said with a smile that he had guessed her name himself, and now it was her turn. Layla was taken aback and, sighing heavily, said that it didn't work that way. She sighed heavily because he was annoying, but she decided to try anyway. After some time, she began to call him names one by one, but all her attempts were in vain. The young lady was shocked, and since she had been guessing his name for a long time, it was in vain. She was puzzled since all her attempts were in vain. She sighed heavily and thought about how she named all the noble families where her peers were. She thought that she would guess, but it was all in vain. She looked at him intently and said that he simply had to give her a little hint. He thought for a moment. A few minutes later, the young man looked at her with a smile and said that the clue was his head. The young lady thought for a moment. She looked at his beautiful blue hair. She looked at him with a puzzled gaze. The young lady wondered how this was supposed to help her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had never thought she was so ignorant about anything. She looked at him in surprise and said that he must be joking. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was not so. He smiled a sly smile and said that he would like to offer her something. He looked at her intently and said that she should guess who he was before the banquet. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this meant that he would be at the banquet. The young lady sighed heavily, as she now understood that she had nothing to be surprised about, since everyone who was not lower than a baron would be at the imperial banquet. She sighed heavily and remembered the banquet, the memories flooding back. The young man looked at her intently as he saw that she was very upset. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't want to go. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood perfectly well that he had understood everything himself and that there was nothing he could do to deny it. She sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. He looked at her intently and asked if he could find out the reason. She knew perfectly well that if she went there, she would have to listen to gossip about her and the Duke. She thought that after their conversation, he would not take the handkerchief from his mistress and her too. She understood perfectly well that she would no longer be able to give it back. She was puzzled because she knew that if the betrothed Duke appeared at his first banquet without a headscarf, it would certainly become the main topic of conversation. The young lady in turn began to nervously bite her lip. The young man reached out to her. She froze in surprise when he touched her lips. He looked at her closely and said that she was biting her lip again. The young lady drew back from him and stood for a moment in confusion. The young man consoled her and asked for forgiveness. He said timidly that he was just afraid that she might bite her lip. He said sheepishly that he had not meant to scare her at all. The young lady sighed heavily and timidly said that he was not to blame for anything. She sighed heavily and said that this was her first appearance in society and she was afraid of making mistakes. He looked at her closely and said that because of the protracted war for many, this banquet would be the first. He looked at the lady he had found and said that she did not need to worry at all. Layla looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him, but a moment later she looked at him with a smile and said that he really was a real gentleman. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he was certainly a hit with the ladies. The young man laughed and said that he almost was. He looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that he was not trying to get the ladies' attention, as he was not interested in it. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She thought it was very strange because in a conversation with a woman, he spoke about female attention, as if she were not a lady. It seemed to Layla that he treated her as an equal. She looked at him intently and said with a soft smile that he knew how to speak beautifully. The young man smiled and said that it was just a trifle. She looked at him agitated and asked if he was sure he wanted her handkerchief. The young man asked if she had changed her mind about giving it to him. She sighed heavily and said that it was not so, but the handkerchief had the Duke's coat of arms on it, and she did not want anyone to see it. He said with a smile that she didn't need to worry about such things at all. The young man came closer to her and quietly asked in her ear that he would hide it very well. The young lady in turn recoiled from him in fright as she did not expect him to come so close to her. She was excited, looked at him, and said that she was very grateful that he would not show it to anyone. She was very surprised and thought that he was kind of strange, but anyway, she felt better from his words. A moment later, she heard her name being called and hurried to the side. The young man caught her hand and asked permission to ask her one more question. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted to know something about taxes. The young man held her hand tightly. He looked intently into her beautiful eyes and said that he wanted to ask this question about her. He looked at her intently and asked if she wanted to join the civil service. The young lady was taken aback and froze in place in surprise. She looked at him intently and asked if he was laughing at her now. The young man looked intently into her eyes and said that he was not joking now, but was asking her completely seriously. She smiled and said that he didn't seem to know that women weren't allowed there. He looked at her intently and said that as far as he knew, there was no such law. She looked at him intently and shouted excitedly that it was not a matter of laws at all, but of traditions. He sighed heavily and said that she had misunderstood him. He asked her if she would like to take advantage of this opportunity if she had it. The young lady looked at him intently and said that of course she would. He looked at his companion with a radiant smile and said that he really hoped that she would not forget this conversation. The young man sat quietly in his office and did paperwork. A moment later, he heard a noise behind the door, and with the speed of lightning, he rose. He was glad that his companion had finally returned. The young man looked at him intently and said that he had completely buried him in work. He looked intently at Emperor Kallian de Zeppel, who was smiling radiantly at him. The emperor looked at his assistant with a radiant smile and asked if he had really overworked himself. The young man, sighing heavily, looked intently at the emperor and asked if he was really serious now. He looked at the emperor intently and asked if he really wanted him to die from overwork. The emperor smiled and said that he certainly did not want that. He approached his assistant and said with a smile that he should know how much he appreciated him. He looked at him in surprise and asked why he was burying him in work. Then the emperor smiled and said that it was all because he trusted him. The young man sighed heavily and begged the emperor to fire him, but the emperor said with a smile that he would never do that. The young man looked at the emperor with tears in his eyes and asked for an assistant, since he was unable to do anything. The emperor sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he could not do anything since he no longer trusted anyone. The young man sighed heavily and wondered if he should betray the emperor and then rest in prison for the rest of his life. The emperor said with a smile that someday he would hire another assistant. The young man beamed with happiness and surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked closely at the emperor and asked if he was not joking. The emperor sighed heavily and said with a smile that he was not joking, but only one assistant. The young man smiled and asked if they could hire several at once. The emperor said with a smile that they could hire no one at all. The young man was taken aback and said with a smile that he would agree to one. He smiled and said that if that was the case, he would immediately ask for letters of recommendation. The emperor looked at him intently and said that this should not be done since they would hold an exam. The young man froze in shock on the spot. There was an administrative exam in the empire. However, it was rarely held. It was all because administrative positions were mostly appointed either by personal recommendations or by excellent graduates of prestigious academies. But even if the emperor decides to carry it out, it is unlikely that he will be able to change the system. The young man sighed heavily and, looking at the emperor, asked when he wanted to take him. The emperor looked at him intently and said that he would like to hold the examination in a month. He sighed heavily and said that there was little time, and also asked if there would be questions only on administration. The emperor sighed heavily and said that the questions should be on administration, taxation, politics, and welfare. The young man was taken aback and, looking at the emperor, asked what he had just said. He looked at the emperor in surprise and asked if he was sure of his words. The emperor smiled and said that his assistant should figure everything out. He sighed heavily as he understood that they would never find such an assistant. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything, and in that case they would advertise about him after the banquet. The emperor looked closely at his assistant and said with a smile that he should definitely include the phrase that women could participate too. The young lady in turn was slowly getting ready for the banquet. Layla knew that the celebration would last for several days today for everyone, and tomorrow only for men. She understood perfectly well that she only had to worry about today, but she was worried and did not know if she could cope. After that incident with the handkerchief, she and the Duke became completely distant from each other. Before they could at least chat a little, but from that day on they didn't talk at all. She was worried and didn't know if she would be at the banquet as well. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with admiration that the outfit suited her very well. She looked at the lady intently and said with a smile that the silver dress wonderfully emphasized her black as night hair. The young lady smiled and asked if it was true. She smiled and said that it was true, and the dress suited her like no one else. The maids happily said that the young lady was simply beautiful. Layla looked closely at her reflection in the mirror. She was embarrassed. She understood perfectly well that the compliments of the maids were part of their job, but she herself really liked the outfit. She smiled and thought to herself that she needed to thank and reward the tailor for his work later. She looked closely at the maids and asked where the Duke was. The maid said that he was already waiting for her in the hall. The young lady said with a smile that in that case they could go. She said that if they didn't want to identify themselves, then they should move out right now. Before she could even get out, the young lady froze in shock as juice was spilled on her gorgeous dress. The maids were taken aback and quickly rushed to their mistress. They were in shock and did not know what to do. The maid was trembling with fear. She was in shock because the mistress's dress was ruined. The young lady looked at her with tears in her eyes and said that she was very sorry because she was in a great hurry to her room and did not notice her at all. Cecile bowed and asked for forgiveness. She said that she did not mean to do it at all. Layla, in turn, looked at the girl intently. She saw that she was shaking and holding her stomach. She sighed heavily because she didn't know at all whether she did it on purpose or it was just a coincidence, but she knew that there was nothing she could do about it. She knew that if she got angry now, she would again be to blame for everything. She looked closely at the maid and asked how many dresses they had taken with them. She asked if there was any silver. She knew that this was not an easy banquet, and the reception was with the emperor, and she needed to sort everything out quickly. She could not be late under any circumstances. The maid sighed heavily and said that there was another silver dress. The young lady was alarmed, knowing that there was no time to choose jewelry and do makeup specifically for another outfit. She knew that she and the Duke had to wear matching suits. She looked at the maid intently and said that she needed any similar dress, and just in case they should bring shoes and a box of jewelry. The maids rushed to do everything in a hurry. She looked hard at the butler and told him to tell the Duke that he had to go to the banquet without her and to bow and say that he would do everything. She turned around with lightning speed and went to her room. Cecile looked intently after the young lady and called her, but did not wait for an answer. A moment later, the emperor was informed that the Duke had arrived. His assistant said that the Duke had arrived alone. The emperor was surprised that the Duke had arrived without a bride. The young man looked out the window and told the emperor that everything was exactly like that. The emperor was very surprised and did not understand why the Duke came alone. He sighed heavily and said anxiously that something had happened. He asked his assistant to postpone the banquet for a while. Layla Tabessa. In high society, she knew all the names, although no one had ever seen the young lady herself. She was never noticeable, but there were various rumors about how a girl from a provincial background managed to get into the Duke's family. No one knew what she had done, but the Duke and Duchess loved her very much. Some considered her the Duke's illegitimate daughter, and some even his mistress when the Duke and Duchess died suddenly, and Philin became the new head of the family. Everyone pounced on the estate like vultures. Of course, this was not advertised publicly. Despite all attempts, the estate not only survived, but also flourished. The young man was a little puzzled, and he did not understand why everything turned out this way. He knew perfectly well that Philin was clearly not very bright. For this reason, when the Duke was gone, no one doubted that the family would collapse. He wondered if he really had such a talented assistant. For a moment he thought about it, as he knew perfectly well that he needed to figure it all out. No one expected this, and everyone knew perfectly well that the estates were not managed by the young Duke, and not even by the gifted assistant who remained there after the Duke's death. There was a young lady who had barely reached adulthood. The young man was amazed at what he learned. The emperor thought about it because after many years on the battlefield, he had already forgotten about this question. But a moment later, he remembered their first meeting and thought now he realized that she ruled the Duke's lands. He sighed heavily as he knew perfectly well that she was forced to be with the idiot Duke. He immediately wanted to let her spread her wings. Bear looked intently at the Emperor and said that everyone was already tired of waiting. The Emperor looked at his assistant in surprise and asked if the Duke was still alone. The young man looked at the Emperor intently and asked if he was asking if his bride, Lady Layla, had arrived. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she was still not here. The Emperor was a little worried and puzzled. He knew very well that the young lady would definitely not miss the imperial banquet. He was wary because he understood that something had happened. The young man looked at the Emperor and said that it was time for him to go to the banquet hall. The Emperor sighed heavily and asked his subordinate to postpone the start of the banquet. Bear was taken aback and looking at the Emperor asked what he was talking about. The Emperor looked at his assistant with a smile and said that so whoever he was waiting for had not yet appeared and the others would have to wait for her. At the same time, the young lady was hurrying to the banquet. She was excited and puzzled. She sighed heavily and slowly got out of the carriage. She changed her clothes as quickly as she could, but was still late for the banquet. The young lady was in a hurry. She was puzzled because she understood that the banquet had already begun. She knew that no one was allowed to appear later than the Emperor, and there could be no excuse for this. She sighed heavily and looked closely at the castle, as she understood that she would have to deal with the attacks herself. She understood perfectly well that she could not allow the Duke's reputation to suffer. The young lady stood still for a moment at the castle doors. Everything seemed very strange to her. She knew that if the banquet had begun, the doors to the hall would have been closed. She looked around in surprise and wondered if they hadn't started yet. The young lady looked at everyone present with a smile. She was glad that the banquet had not yet begun. Layla breathed a sigh of relief as she had not even hoped for such an outcome of events. The Duke slowly approached her and angrily asked what she was so happy about. He looked at her with fury and asked if she understood what the consequences of her being late could be. The young lady was taken aback and called him by name. She sighed heavily, for of course she could tell that the young lady had spilled wine on her dress, but she didn't want to justify herself to him again. She looked intently at the young man and asked for forgiveness. A moment later she froze in place in surprise as she noticed a handkerchief in his breast pocket. Layla looked at him closely. She wondered if he had a handkerchief now, what happened to his mistress? She sighed heavily because she saw that it was too shabby. The Duke in turn said that the handkerchief belonged to his mother. He said that if he had come without a handkerchief, then everyone would have spread rumors, and not only about him, but also about his bride. The young lady looked at him intently. She did not know what to answer. She felt relieved when she heard that the handkerchief was from the Duchess. For a moment she felt sad, as she missed the late Duchess very much. He looked at her intently, asked why she was so frowning. He asked if she was unhappy about something. She sighed heavily and said that everything was wrong. Layla said with an innocent smile that she had simply remembered the Duchess. She looked at the Duke in surprise and asked why the banquet had not yet begun. The Duke sighed heavily and said that for some reason the Emperor was delayed. She was surprised. She did not know why everything happened this way, but she was grateful for it. And due to the Emperor's delay, she was not late. A moment later, all the guests present were informed of a meeting with the Emperor. Layla froze in shock and surprise as she saw the Emperor in all his glory before her. She was in shock and simply could not believe her eyes. The Emperor looked at her intently with his radiant smile. She thought for a moment, and now it dawned on her that the symbol of the imperial family, the blue dragon blue hair and blue eyes, were on the young man. Then he would tell her with a smile that his head, this clue to his origins. She understood perfectly well that because of the protracted war, he had never made his debut in high society. She was a little upset because unfortunately she could not recognize the Emperor himself. She understood perfectly well that this was a shame on her part. Layla was taken aback because she heard someone calling her. She looked at the Duke in surprise. The Duke looked intently at his bride and asked what she was thinking about. She looked away from him and said timidly that she had not thought of anything like that, and she also asked if he really wanted something. He said nervously that he didn't mean anything like that. The young lady looked at her fiancé in surprise. She did not understand what was happening to him and why he was behaving in this way. The emperor looked closely at all those present, and with a radiant smile said that he was very glad that they had come on such a wonderful day. He looked at everyone present and raised his glass with a smile to their empire. The duke looked at his bride and asked her with a smile if she wanted to dance. She smiled and agreed with him. She sighed heavily as she had never liked dancing, but she knew she had to dance with him. She understood perfectly well that they needed to show everyone present that everything was fine in their relationship. The young lady danced slowly with the duke. She mentally replayed all the steps in her head. He looked at her intently and with a radiant smile said that she had never been able to dance. She looked at him intently and said, offended that he himself was not a great dancer. He smiled and leaning closer to her quietly said that at least he knew how to lead. She sighed heavily and embarrassedly said that he was a good boy. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he liked her dress very much. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He smiled and said that it was obvious from the outside that she had been preparing for her debut for a long time. The young lady sighed heavily and asked if he really thought this was the original dress. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it wasn't so. She sighed heavily and laughed nervously as she realized that it seemed like he had completely forgotten that they had matching silver suits. She realized that he hadn't bothered to remember that information in the first place. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he had said something wrong. She sighed heavily and was upset and said that everything was fine. A moment later, a man approached them and called the duke. The young lady decided to leave them to talk. She sighed heavily as she was glad that he was distracted as just a little more, and she would not have been able to contain her anger. A moment later, the young lady heard someone calling her. Turning around, she saw the marquise. The marquise looked at her with a smile as she was surprised that she knew her. A moment later, a young lady approached them and asked with a smile what they were talking about. Layla sighed heavily and looked at them with a smile. She was puzzled because she wanted to be alone. The young lady looked at Layla intently and said with a smile that her elegance was worthy of a duchess. Layla smiled and thanked her. The young ladies looked at her intently and asked when they would get married because they knew that the war was already over. They said that unfortunately she had to postpone the wedding because of the war. They smiled and said that she needed to hurry up and have children sooner. The countess came up to them and said with a grin that it didn't matter because the duke already had an heir. Layla looked at her intently but said nothing. Once upon a time, the young lady along with Layla was a candidate for the role of the young duke's bride. Then everyone thought that the duke and his wife would undoubtedly choose Sophia, and of course she herself thought so. When she was told that Layla had been chosen, she did something terrible. Sophia was furious. She screamed at the young lady that she knew she had cheated. She screamed that otherwise she would have been chosen for the place of honor. No one ever found out that Sophia had hit the young lady because the duke had paid her parents a lot of money to hide everything. Of course, for them, money was more important than the stubborn daughter. After all, the young lady married the count. Layla was a little puzzled as she never thought that they would meet again in such a place. Sophia looked at them with a smile and said that they needed to know what they were talking about before they opened their mouths. She looked at them intently and said with a grin that something was wrong with them, not with her, because everyone knew perfectly well that the duke already had a child, and besides, he valued his mother very much. Sophia looked closely at the young lady and said that she had heard that the girl was the princess of the kingdom, and yet she was pure-blooded, unlike some others. Layla looked closely at the young lady as she understood that she was not hinting, but saying point-blank that she was the illegitimate daughter of a count. She looked at everyone present as everyone else thought the same. Sophia looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if she had really touched a nerve. Layla looked at her closely and said with a smile that it was not so. She said that she might not be of the best blood, but still she was a countess and not a former princess. She smiled and said that a young lady without her country was nothing. She looked at the countess with fury and said that the past was not important and only the future was important. She said that in this future she would certainly become the duchess. She looked at Sophia intently and said that she would remain only a countess for the rest of her days. Sophia was furious at such words. The young lady looked at everyone present and with a soft smile said that she needed to be alone and also asked all the ladies present if they would mind if she left them. They with a smile said that everything was fine. The lady in turn slowly left them and went to the terrace. She went out onto the terrace and sighed with relief. She was a little puzzled and wondered what they were saying behind her back when the Countess, without hesitation, said something similar to her face. She was puzzled and very tired for a moment, she thought, as she wanted to sit over papers now and not be present at this celebration. She sighed heavily and said that she would like to return to the estate as soon as possible. The young man looked at her intently and said with a smile that the banquet had just begun and she already wanted to leave. She turned around as she did not expect to see anyone on the terrace. The Emperor looked at her intently with a smile on his face and greeted her. The young lady was shocked she introduced herself again and greeted the son of the Empire. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was now very formal. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that for this reason he did not want to say who he really was, but unfortunately it was impossible to hide something like that. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile what his name was. A moment later, the young lady looked at him intently and said his name. He sighed heavily and said that she had said his name quite accurately. He smiled and said that since it was no longer a secret who he really was, he would like to switch to an informal tone of conversation. She sighed heavily and said that she would do as he wished. He looked at her intently and asked what she was doing there. Layla looked at him in surprise and said that she wanted to get some fresh air. He looked into the distance and said that the banquet was very stuffy. The Emperor looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she was sure she was standing comfortably. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. He looked at her closely and said that this did not seem true. A moment later he said that this would not do and pulling her by the hand sat her down on a small stool. The young lady was taken aback. She was surprised as she did not expect such a thing. He asked with a smile why she should stand when there was somewhere to sit. She looked at him in surprise and said that he was still standing. He said with a smile that there was nothing wrong with that, and besides he wasn't wearing heels. She sighed heavily and thanked him, saying that he was very kind. He looked at her with a smile and said that there was nothing to thank him for and that she could deny herself nothing. The Emperor looked closely at his companion and asked with a smile if she was enjoying the banquet. She sighed heavily and said with a soft smile that the banquet was simply wonderful. He smiled and said that he could see that she was lying and that she had long been bored with the banquet. He sighed heavily and said with a smile that, to tell the truth, he was also bored with the banquet and would much rather deal with paperwork. The Emperor looked closely at the young lady and asked if she agreed with him. She looked at him with embarrassment, as it seemed to her that he seemed to read her thoughts. She was surprised that the Emperor could not tolerate such banquets. She had the feeling that even though she knew who he was, she could talk to him freely. He smiled and asked why she was looking at him with such an intent gaze. The young lady was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. She realized that she had made a mistake. He smiled and said that she did not need to apologize at all. He was just asking why she was looking like that. She looked away from him in embarrassment and began to speak timidly. She did not know what to answer to his question. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked if there was something on his face. Layla sighed heavily and said that it was not so. He thought for a moment and asked if he really looked worse than usual today. The lady laughed timidly and froze in embarrassment. She understood that he was talking nonsense with a very serious expression on his face. The Emperor was taken aback and looked at the young lady in surprise. The young lady in turn shuddered as she realized that she had not held back her laughter. She was taken aback and asked him to forgive her for being so rude. He looked at her with a smile and said that he hadn't meant anything like that at all. The Emperor looked at the young lady intently and said that she should understand him correctly. He said that he really liked it when she smiled. Layla looked at the Emperor in surprise as she did not expect to hear anything like that from him. She sighed heavily and said embarrassedly that he was making fun of her again. He looked at her intently and said that he had never meant to do such a thing. The Emperor smiled softly and said that he was simply saying what he thought. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really said that to everyone. He said with a smile that he says something like that to everyone he likes. She was taken aback and asked timidly and surprised if he really liked her too. He smiled and said that it was true. Layla looked at him in surprise and asked why that was. The Emperor slowly began to walk away from his companion. He smiled and asked her if there really had to be a reason. She looked after him in surprise and asked if there really didn't need to be a reason for this. He looked at her intently and asked what she thought was the reason. She thought for a moment. She looked at the emperor intently and said that he seemed to like beautiful and smart women. He smiled and asked if she really meant that she was beautiful and smart. The young lady looked at the emperor with embarrassment and cried out that of course this was not so. The emperor sighed heavily and said that it seemed she did not yet understand her worth. He said with a sly smile that he loved to make diamonds out of diamonds. Layla looked at the emperor in surprise, but said nothing. A moment later, the emperor's knight approached them and called him. The knight looked intently at the emperor and said that he was already expected at the banquet. The emperor in turn sighed heavily. He understood perfectly well that it was time for him to leave. The young lady in turn saw that he was already about to leave. She understood that she had to see him off. She slowly rose to her feet in order to approach him. But unfortunately it happened that due to her carelessness, she stumbled and began to fall. With the speed of lightning, the emperor caught the young lady and called her. He was surprised. He looked at her closely and asked if she was hurt. The young lady was taken aback and asked the emperor for forgiveness. She said that she was fine. He looked at her closely and said with a soft smile that usually in such cases one says, "Thank you, not ask for forgiveness." Layla in turn thanked the emperor for his help. He looked at her closely and asked if she was sure she didn't have any pain anywhere. The emperor said excitedly that he could send for a doctor. Layla was taken aback and said that there was no need for that. He looked at her intently and said with a gentle smile that he was very glad that she was okay. As he left, he looked at the young lady with a smile. She sighed heavily as she now understood that he was a very generous man. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard some noise. She froze in place when she saw her fiancé walking towards her with a cold expression on his face. She looked at him in surprise and called him by name. Layla was a little scared as she saw that he was very angry. He came closer to her angrily and asked if she was cheating on him. Layla froze in shock. She didn't understand what he was talking about. He shouted furiously that he couldn't believe that she had managed to have an affair, and in such a place, she looked at him in surprise and asked if he really dared to accuse her of cheating. She quickly pushed her fiancé away and told him to stop saying such things. He looked at her with fury and shouted at her to stop denying everything as he had seen it with his own eyes. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she had only had a conversation with His Majesty. She looked at him intently and asked if he was really talking about this now. The Duke in turn was furious. He shouted that they were not just talking, and he saw with his own eyes how they were hugging. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that she had simply tripped and he had helped her. The Duke looked at her with fury and asked if she really thought he would believe her. He was angry and shouted that he had seen her smiling at the emperor. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked how she should behave in the presence of the emperor. She asked if she should get angry or cry. He sighed heavily and looked away. The Duke was a little puzzled. He said that she had never laughed like that with him. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted her to laugh. Layla looked at him with fury and asked if he knew why she hadn't even smiled lately. She screamed that she simply had no reason to do so. She looked at him with fury and asked if after the way he had treated her like that she would smile. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked what he had done to her. She sighed heavily and wondered if he really didn't understand what he had done. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was talking about Cecile now. He looked at his companion intently and said that he had already told her that the only thing that mattered to him was the child, and as soon as she gave birth to it, he would immediately drive the young lady away. Layla sighed heavily and told the Duke that she did not believe him. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she didn't believe him. She asked him angrily why she should trust him. She said that all he does is fuss over his mistress and he hasn't cared about her for a long time. He looked at his bride intently and said timidly that Cecile could not cope alone. The young lady was furious. She wondered if he really thought she could cope with everything, and that was why he had dumped everything on her. She looked at him intently and told him furiously to answer her honestly. She asked if he was going to marry her or if the Duchess's place had already been taken by another. The young lady looked at him with fury and shouted that it seemed to be so. She shouted that she did not believe a word he said. She said that if he was really serious, he must prove it. The young lady looked at the Duke intently. She really wanted him to throw out his mistress. She sighed heavily because she wanted to say it, but unfortunately she could not stoop so low. She understood perfectly well that his mistress was carrying the Duke's child. He looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted him to prove the seriousness of his intentions. She looked at him intently and said that everything was exactly so. The Duke, in turn, was burning with anger. He grabbed his bride by the hand and said that he would certainly prove everything to her. She looked at him in surprise since she did not understand what he intended to do. He pulled her by the hand down the long corridor of the banquet hall, the young lady screaming for him to stop. A moment later, the Duke approached the Emperor and called him. The Emperor looked at the Duke with a smile and asked what was wrong. The Duke looked at the Emperor intently and said that he needed his permission. The Duke looked at the Emperor intently and said very loudly that he was asking him to bless their marriage. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand what he was doing now. For a moment there was a dead silence in the banquet hall. The Emperor looked intently at the young man and, asking for forgiveness with a soft smile, said that he could not do this. The Duke looked at the Emperor in surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing at all. The Emperor looked at the Duke with a dull expression, wondering if he was so stupid that he didn't understand. The Duke looked at the Emperor with fury and asked permission to find out the reason for the refusal. The Emperor looked at the Duke intently as he understood that he was simply an idiot and was digging his own grave. Qatar smiled and asked the Duke if he really didn't know. The Duke was furious. He looked at the Emperor intently. He began to say that the Emperor was in a relationship with his bride, but the young lady stopped her fiancé and said that of course the Duke knew everything. She understood perfectly well that when there was a big celebration at the imperial court, the rest of the nobility had to postpone all major celebrations for several months. She knew that today was the banquet in honor of the coronation of the new emperor. She looked closely at the Emperor and said that the Duke did not want to appear ignorant. The Duke in turn looked at his bride with surprise and bewilderment. The Emperor looked at the young lady with a smile and asked why the Duke had asked such a question, since he knew the answer to it. The young lady glanced sideways at his fiancé and said that in order to have the wedding within a year, they would need to get the Emperor's permission as soon as possible, and it was unknown when you would have another chance to ask for it. She looked at the Emperor intently and said that he should know for himself how long it takes to prepare for a wedding. The Emperor looked at the young lady with a gentle smile as he saw that she had decided to get out of this situation very effectively. She looked closely at her fiancé and asked with a smile if he really wanted to marry her so much that he was so quick to ask the Emperor for permission. The Duke was taken aback and said that of course that was the case. She sighed heavily as she realized that the conflict had been resolved quickly. Everyone present began to whisper. They said that it seemed that the Duke himself doted on his bride. Everyone wanted the Emperor to bless their marriage as soon as possible. They thought that they had some problems in the family, but it seemed that the mistress was just a mistress. The Emperor watched everything that was happening with a smile. He understood that the young lady had managed not only to defend the Duke's honor, but also to convince everyone that they had a very good relationship. The Emperor looked at the young men and said with a smile that unfortunately he was a little busy at the moment, but they should come to him in a month. He looked at the Duke and asked if he could wait a little longer. The Duke in turn looked at the Emperor with fury and said that of course he would wait. The Emperor looked closely at the young lady. He knew perfectly well that no matter what he could not allow her to ruin her life in this way. He wanted to ask his assistant to speed up the preparation for the exam. Sometime later, the young people were slowly returning to the estate. The young lady looked intently at the Duke. She did not understand what was happening to him. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she didn't tell him that there were any rules. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He asked angrily if she really wanted to humiliate him in front of the Emperor. She sighed heavily, and looking at the young man said that of course she had no intention of doing such a thing. She was in shock, did not understand what he was saying again. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she could not know what he was really planning. She asked for forgiveness and said that unfortunately she could not read minds. The Duke was taken aback and said angrily that she could have given him at least some sign. She sighed heavily as she did not want to listen to him at all. Layla was puzzled. She knew that without the title of Duchess, she would be nobody. They had not yet had time to get out of the carriage when suddenly the young lady screamed and called the Duke. The Duke in turn ran up to his mistress with a radiant smile and greeted her. The young lady in turn slowly exited the carriage and froze for a moment as she saw that the Duke was tenderly embracing his mistress. She was surprised because she knew he adored her so much that he even allowed her to leave the estate. She turned away from them because it hurt her to watch such a thing. She was furious and wondered if he really thought this was normal. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said that she needed to eat. The young lady sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she had no time for that now. The maid was worried and told her mistress that she had not been able to have lunch because she had seen the Duke off. The young lady said that it was no big deal and that she would eat later. A moment later, Cecile entered her room. Looking at the young lady, she asked with a smile if she was busy. Layla was shocked as it was the first time the girl came to her in person. She wondered if something had happened. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said that she had to have lunch. Layla sighed heavily and said that she would do everything later and asked the maid to go out for a while. The young lady looked at her intently and asked with a smile how she was doing. Layla looked at her intently and asked if she needed anything. She also said that she was busy at the moment. She smiled and said that she had only come to see her for a short time. She looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she had heard about her. They were going to leave next week. Layla sighed heavily and said that was exactly it. Cecile looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she would like to take a little walk before leaving. Layla looked at her in surprise and asked why she was asking such a thing. Cecile said with a smile that she really hoped that Layla would be able to buy her something. She smiled and said that she needed baby clothes and toys. Layla looked at the young lady intently but did not answer. She looked at her and asked what was wrong with her, and also asked if she had said that it was not so. Layla sighed heavily and asked why she would do that. Cecile looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and said that she was, after all, the future adoptive mother of her child. She looked at her intently and said that they were no longer in the kingdom and therefore she had no personal servants. She looked at Layla intently and said that that was why she decided to ask her since it was her duty anyway. Layla, in turn, was furious. She did not understand how a simple mistress could compare her to a servant. She looked at her intently, for she saw that she had an innocent face, but she had neither shame nor conscience. She looked at her intently, and with an innocent smile told the girl to stop pretending and get out quickly. She looked at her with a surprised look and asked what she was talking about. Layla looked at her with a cold look and told her to stop calling her miss. Layla told the young lady that she should call her lady and nothing else. She said that her kingdom was no more and she was nobody. The young lady in turn looked at her with fury and shouted that no matter what, she was still a princess. Layla looked at her closely and said that she was a princess, but now she was a commoner. Layla sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that she was only addressing her politely because she was carrying the Duke's child. Layla said that until the young lady gave birth, she would treat her with dignity. She looked at her intently and said that while she was here, she should stop getting underfoot. Cecile looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Passing by the young lady, Layla asked if the Duke had not told her anything. She said in a calm manner that the Duke wanted to kick her out immediately after giving birth. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. Layla glanced sideways at the young lady as she realized that she seemed to be out of the loop. She sighed heavily and said that she could guarantee that she would be a good mother, but she would not harm the child. For a while, the young lady stood quietly and listened. She did not react in any way. Layla slowly opened the door and, looking at the young lady, said with a smile that she need not worry and that she had better collect all her things. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was all right. Layla sighed heavily and told the maid to clean the sofa, and she also said that she needed to rest and asked the maid to find another place. The young lady sighed heavily. Unfortunately, nothing helped her and she could not concentrate. She thought for a moment and decided to take a little nap. She knew she needed to sleep a little as she still had a lot of work to do. Sometime later, the young lady was awakened by a noise. Opening her eyes, she saw the Duke in front of her, who was burning with rage. He looked at her with fury and asked what was wrong with her. She sighed heavily because she understood that he wanted to start a conversation about his mistress again. She understood perfectly well that he could not care about anyone else as much as he did about her. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked at his bride with anger and asked why she threatened the young lady. Layla looked at him in surprise and asked how she threatened her. Layla looked at the Duke and said that the young lady was no longer a princess, but for some reason she treated her like a servant. She looked at the Duke and said that she simply informed her that she would only be living here until she gave birth. He looked at her with fury and said that the young lady had just lost her country. He did not understand how she could boldly tell her such a thing. He looked at her with fury and shouted that he should have told her everything, not her. Layla looked at the Duke intently and asked if he told her that she was right. The Duke hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Layla sighed heavily. She said that he was not able to confess to her, so she did it instead of him. He looked at his bride with fury and asked who she thought she was. She looked at him calmly and said that in fact she was his fiancé. He sighed heavily and said angrily that everything was exactly like that. But a moment later, he looked at her with a cold and furious gaze and said that she was still not his wife. The young lady stood frozen in shock and surprise. He looked at her closely and said that it seemed that all these years she had spent here had given her the wrong impression. He said angrily that she was not a duchess yet, so she should not meddle in other people's business. Layla was shocked. She tried for the sake of those who loved her like their own daughter. She was very angry because she had done a lot for the Duke's family. She sighed heavily and wondered if he really wanted to throw her out because of her mistress. He looked at her furiously and asked if she could hear him. A moment later, she realized that all her memories had been shattered into pieces. She sighed heavily and said that she understood him. He started to speak, but the young lady interrupted him and said that she would no longer work there. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about mentally. The young lady asked for forgiveness from the late Duchess and Duke. She said that she was very sorry that this happened. She sighed heavily as she knew she couldn't take it anymore. She slowly handed him the seal and said that, as he had said earlier, she was just an ordinary girl, so she had no right to decide anything here. He looked at her in surprise and said that he didn't think she was that irresponsible. She looked at him furiously and told him to repeat what he had said immediately. Layla looked at him in surprise and asked if he had forgotten whose duties these were. She said that the Duke should do everything. She looked at him intently and said that he should do the work, not her, and he had simply dumped all the duties on her and forgotten about everything. Layla looked intently at the Duke and shouted that these were all the Duchess's concerns, and that they did not concern her at all. She was only the Count's daughter, so now he would have to do everything himself. She slowly decided to leave the office. He asked her angrily if she really thought that this would change anything. The Duke angrily said that she was wrong if she thought that he would apologize and beg her to stay. As she left, she said that he had opened her eyes, and from that day on she would do only what was required of Lady Tebessa. She gave him the documents as she left and said that he had achieved his goal. She looked at the Duke with fury and said that she had nothing more to say to him, and therefore she was leaving. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she had received letters, but Layla stopped her. As she left, she said that from now on, everything that concerned work they should take to the Duke. The maid was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. The young lady sighed heavily and said that from now on, all matters would be handled directly by the Duke. The maid looked after the young lady in surprise and asked if something had happened. The young lady, in turn, had no intention of answering this question. She sighed heavily and asked to be left alone. The young man looked at the Duke intently and said that the young lady had asked him to give her the documents. The Duke was furious, wondering if she thought he wanted to understand anything about the documents. The Duke was shocked. He did not understand why his wife needed so much to prepare for the rainy season. He did not understand how much a month was needed to maintain the estate. He was shocked, wondering if they really meant to say that they spent so much money every year. He sighed heavily and looked closely at the documents with a smile on his face. He understood that the young lady was not so smart after all, since they had wasted a lot of money. He wondered if he should discuss this issue with her. The Duke sighed heavily. He knew that he had to decide everything himself, and then she would definitely stop sticking her nose up in the air. He thought with a grin that she would no longer look down on him. For a moment he thought, and he understood that he needed to check the expenses as well. He was puzzled and did not understand how he could understand that everything was correct. He sighed heavily and said that they needed to find the papers that his father left behind. A moment later, a servant entered his office and asked if he had called him. The Duke looked at the servant and said that he needed the key to the library. Sometime later, a young lady entered his office and hugged him with a smile. She looked closely at the Duke and asked what he was doing. He beamed at the young lady and said he was just looking at a couple of documents. She smiled and said he seemed busy. She apologized for disturbing him. She said she just really wanted to spend some time with him after talking to the lady. He looked at her in surprise but said nothing. A moment later, he smiled and said that, of course, she could stay in the office. She was surprised but happily asked if it was true. She smiled and asked if he needed to work. He smiled and said that all the work could wait. The young lady hugged him with a smile and thanked him. She said that she was very happy now. The man entered the office and told the Duke that he had brought the key. The Duke, in turn, looked at the man with fury. A moment later, the Duke told the man that he should put the key on the table and he would take care of business later. The man sighed heavily but still obeyed his master. The young lady looked closely at the documents that were on the table. She saw that preparations were underway for the rainy season. The Duke looked closely at his beloved and said with a smile that she hadn't even gotten a bit fatter. He smiled and said that if he hadn't known she was pregnant, he would never have guessed. She smiled and said that it was not so, and that she had gained a lot of weight. He looked at her with a smile and said that she just had a cute little belly. He didn't understand how she managed to do that. She hugged him with a smile and said that she was ticklish. She glanced sideways at the documents as she understood that during the rainy season it was necessary to call the archipelago. She looked at the young man intently and asked if she could ask him something. She looked at him seriously and told him to just promise that he would do it. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really wanted him to promise her before she told him. She looked at him intently and asked him to promise her this, because it concerned their child. He looked at her in surprise, but still agreed. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he would really do it. A moment later, she told him what she wanted. The young lady sighed heavily as unfortunately she could not sleep. She was a little puzzled and worried as she didn't even know what to do with herself now. She wondered what she was doing in her free time. She thought for a moment and decided that she should read something. She thought it was a very good idea and decided to go to the library. The young man looked at his mistress and asked for forgiveness. He said that unfortunately the Duke had taken the key. She looked at him in surprise and said that she had previously thought that the key should always be kept by the butler. The man said that everything was exactly like that, but last night the gentleman demanded that he leave the key with him. The young lady was surprised as she did not expect the Duke to visit the library. She knew that it was not a training hall at all. She wondered if it was all because of the documents. She was surprised and did not expect this from him at all. She thought that he would not even look at them. She looked closely at the man and asked if there was a spare key. The man sighed heavily and said that unfortunately there was only one key, and therefore if anyone lost the key, they would have to change the lock. She sighed heavily because she understood that she would have to ask the Duke for the key. She even felt awkward talking to him after what happened. She looked at the man and asked if the Duke was in the library. The butler sighed heavily and said that he was still sleeping. She sighed heavily as she understood that the Duke's mistress was now with him. But the young lady understood perfectly well that she would have to forget about this idea. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. The maid looked at the lady intently and said that the archipelago's assistant had tried to contact her. The young lady looked at him intently and said that it was time for them to go. Sometime later, the young lady was sitting at the table. She wanted to contact the assistant through the magic ball. The man told the young lady that they had not seen each other for a long time. She greeted the Viscount and asked if something had happened. He sighed heavily and said that he would like to discuss with her the preparations for the rainy season. She sighed heavily as she understood perfectly well that there was no other reason to contact her now. The young lady said that this matter no longer concerned her. The Viscount was surprised and did not understand how everything happened. The young lady said that now everything was decided by the Duke himself. The Viscount asked if he really needed to contact the Duke. He said that he understood her, but they urgently needed to approve a new budget. She said that he could contact him directly and discuss everything. The Viscount sighed heavily and said that he was glad to do so, but he could only use the communication device for a limited time, and now she would have to do everything herself. He asked her to hand over the documents to the Duke. The young lady froze for a moment as she realized that the connection had been broken. She knew that the orb could be used for a short time, but unfortunately it had to be filled with magic over several days. The young lady sighed heavily and said that in that case she would go to the Duke. She knew that no matter how awkward she felt, now was not the time to give in to emotions. She decided that she might as well ask the Duke for the key. The young lady knocked on the door, but her fiancé's mistress came out to her. Cecile looked at the young lady intently and asked if something had happened. Layla looked at the girl intently. She noticed that she did not take off the pendant even when she slept, and this was very strange. She looked at her intently and asked where the Duke was. The young lady smiled and said that he had not woken up yet because he was very tired during the night. She looked at him intently and asked when he was going to get up. Cecile smiled and said that he would wake up whenever he wanted, and also asked if he needed to eat anything. Layla was furious because the girl did not even try to behave a little decently with her. She looked at her intently and said that when the Duke woke up, she should tell him that she was looking for him. A moment later, the Duke came out of the room and said that it was no use. He looked at her intently and asked what she wanted. The young man looked at the Emperor in surprise and asked what he was looking at so intently. He was surprised, and looking at the Emperor said that he was looking closely at the simple handkerchief. The Emperor looked at his assistant with a radiant smile and said that he was very handsome. He asked his assistant if this was true. The Emperor looked at his assistant with a radiant smile and asked if he thought the scarf was beautiful. The young man froze in shock. He didn't know what to answer. He looked closely at the Emperor and said that it seemed that his eyesight had deteriorated. He asked the Emperor if he should order glasses. The Emperor, with a satisfied smile, hit the table, and it fell to the ground with a crash, and the documents flew into pieces. The young man was in shock. He did not understand what was happening to the Emperor. The Emperor looked closely at his assistant and asked for forgiveness with a smile. He said that unfortunately he could not see where he was going and that he was completely blind. The young man sighed heavily, for he knew that the Emperor was a complete liar. The Emperor looked at his assistant and asked how the preparation for the exam was going. Bear, collecting the documents, told the Emperor that he would like to discuss this issue with him. He handed him some documents and asked if the questions on the exam would be difficult enough. The Emperor was shocked looking at his assistant. He asked if this was some kind of joke. The Emperor looked at the assistant with anger and asked if he really made up questions for idiots. The young man sighed heavily and said that the questions were not that simple. The Emperor looked at his assistant and said that the questions were as simple as could be, and he tore the sheets in half. The young man was shocked. He had not expected anything like this at all. He told his assistant to make them 10 times more difficult. Bear was shocked. He looked at the Emperor with a puzzled expression and asked if he was definitely going to hire someone for the position. The Emperor said, with a smile, that of course he intended to hire a person, and he even had someone in mind. The Emperor looked at him intently and said with a smile that unfortunately he would not accept anyone without an exam. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she had come. He looked at her intently and asked with a smirk on his face if she really decided to apologize for yesterday. She looked at him in surprise, since she had no intention of doing anything like that. Layla looked at the Duke intently and asked what she had to apologize for. The Duke, in turn, looked at the young lady with fury. He was very angry with her. Layla sighed heavily and said that she had spoken to the Viscount and told him to contact the Duke with any questions. She looked at the Duke and said that the Viscount needed documents to prepare for the rainy season. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that he was just about to do so. He looked at her closely and asked if she had drawn up the appropriate documents. She said that she didn't do it and that the assistant did everything, but she personally checked everything. The Duke, in turn, only looked at her with a grin. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what was happening to her. She looked closely at the Duke and asked if there was something wrong with the documents. As he left, he said that that was exactly it, but he wouldn't tell her that. He looked at her intently and said that it was no longer her business and he didn't need her help. The young lady in turn froze in place in surprise as his words hit her painfully in the chest. As he left, he said with a smile that he really hoped they wouldn't return to this issue again. The young lady froze in place in surprise and shock. She was puzzled because she had not even had time to ask about the keys to the library. She looked at the man in surprise and asked if the Duke had already sent the documents. The man bowed to the young lady and said that everything was exactly like that, and she didn't need to worry about such things at all. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. She thought she would look in on him again if there was no news. She thought for a moment, knowing that it was no longer her business. A moment later, she saw some kind of invitation on the table. Layla noticed that the letter was from Count Byzantin. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why he would suddenly invite her somewhere. She wondered if the invitation given to her was really from Sophia. She wondered if the Countess wanted to take it out on her after the banquet. With lightning speed, young Lydia tore up the invitation since she had no intention of participating in this at all. The maid looked at her mistress with a joyful smile and asked if she had already heard the news. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The maid said with a smile that His Majesty the Emperor was looking for a new assistant. She looked closely at the lady and said with a smile that it was written that even women were accepted. She smiled and said that now everyone was going crazy. The young lady in turn thought for a moment. She understood perfectly well that women had never occupied such positions, but for the first time a special emphasis was placed on this. She thought for a moment and remembered the Emperor who asked her if she would be a civil servant, if she had the opportunity. She wondered with a smile if this was all for her sake. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Layla looked at the maid intently and told her to find out immediately what she needed to do to get this position. There was less than a month left before the exam. The exam will have questions on tax management, politics, social welfare, and there should be 7 sections in total. The young lady thought about this all the time. She knew that if the Emperor himself was looking for an assistant, then he should understand everything. She sighed heavily because she knew that it would not be easy for her, but she was not going to give up at all. She slowly reached for the book but suddenly froze because the young man said that there was an excellent book on politics, and he would recommend it. The young lady turned around and froze in place for a moment in surprise as she saw the Emperor standing before her. She called him and addressed him formally, but he stopped her. He looked at her intently and with a satisfied smile asked her not to give him away. She thanked him for the advice but also said that she had already read the book in question. For a moment the Emperor wondered what other book he could recommend to her. He looked closely at another book and asked what about her. She sighed heavily and said that she had read it too. For some time he listed all the books to her, but she had already read them all. He looked at her with a smile and said that apparently she was doing quite well with politics. He thought for a moment and said that now they would have to raise the bar even higher. The young lady looked at him in surprise. The Emperor looked at her intently and asked with a smile if he could ask her for a favor as he needed her help. Layla looked at him in surprise as she did not understand how she could help him. She followed the Emperor because he needed her help. She looked around intently as they walked. She didn't understand what he was looking for. She looked around the city and they walked in silence, not talking. Sometime later, they stopped at a cellar. The man looked closely at the Emperor and said with a smile that he should believe that these seeds will germinate even in the rainy season, and from the moisture they will even grow faster. The man smiled and said that the rainy season was coming soon. He told the Emperor that he could plant them and forget about any worries. A moment later, the man extended his hand where the seeds were flaunted, and the young lady froze in shock. The Emperor looked at him intently and said with a smile that he had persuaded him. The young lady looked at the Emperor in a hurry and said that he should under no circumstances buy them. The Emperor looked at her in surprise and asked why he shouldn't do that. The young lady said in all seriousness that the man was lying. The man was taken aback and looked at the young lady in bewilderment as he had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. She looked at the man intently and said that he was now showing them the quilt seeds. The man froze in shock. She looked at them intently and said that quilt grows in the eastern deserts. It is eaten by nomads, and to say that it will grow well in the rainy season is a blatant lie. The Emperor looked at the man with a smile on his face. The man was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the man said, puzzled, that unfortunately this was the first time he was selling such seeds, and perhaps he had misunderstood something when he had taken them himself. The young lady understood perfectly well that he had a lot of seeds for sale, and he was trying to defend himself as if he did not understand them. The man quickly told the young men that they could take the seeds as an apology. He quickly gathered all his goods and said that it was time for him to go. The young lady looked at the man in surprise and asked the emperor if they were really going to let him go just like that. The emperor sighed heavily and said that the man would be caught. Layla was surprised and did not understand who would catch him. The emperor said that his guards would do everything. You looked at the young lady and told her not to look around so much as she would attract unnecessary attention, and all the swindlers would run away. She sighed heavily and said that she would not do that. The emperor looked at her with a smile. He looked at her intently and with a smile and said that she knew less about plants. He said with a smile that she never ceased to amaze him. She sighed heavily and said that everyone knows that. He looked at her with a smile and said that he did not know about it. The emperor looked at the young lady and asked who he was then. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer his question. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback and shouted that she had not meant to offend him at all. Callian looked at her with a smile and said that he was just joking, and she did not need to worry. A moment later, he handed her something and told her with a smile to take it. He looked at her closely and said that he thought she would find a better use for them. The young lady froze in surprise, but still thanked the emperor. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really come here for seeds. He smiled and said that something like, that. A moment later, his face changed and he said angrily that he was looking for some plant. She looked closely at the emperor as she had a feeling that he was up to something bad. A moment later, he gave her a beaming smile and thanked her for her help. He smiled and asked if she would like to help him find the plant as well. The young lady thought for a moment, and for a moment she remembered her fiancé, to whom he had told with fury that he did not need her help at all. She understood perfectly well that those words were spoken to her by the Duke, but now the emperor was saying that he needed her. She looked intently at the emperor, who was giving her his beautiful and radiant smile. She had already forgotten what it was like to be needed by someone. She looked at the emperor with wonderful joy and said that she agreed and would be happy to help him. The emperor in turn froze in surprise and embarrassment on the spot as he saw her beautiful, radiant smile which she gave him. He looked away from her in embarrassment because he knew perfectly well that she had a very beautiful smile, but he didn't know that it was so beautiful. He happily extended his hand to her and said that in that case they could go on their search. The young lady froze for a moment, but a few seconds later she took his hand and they went on their search. The emperor looked at her intently, confusion on his face. He knew that holding hands was not really necessary. Callian looked closely at the young lady and wondered how she could follow a stranger without any fear. He knew perfectly well that she could certainly stand up for herself. He was a little puzzled as he knew that he could easily lull her into a false sense of security in order to attack her when she least expected it. He sighed heavily as he realized that she had followed him, just like a stupid cat that had been lured with a fish. He mentally scolded himself as he didn't understand what he was thinking. The young lady in turn looked at the emperor with bewilderment. The emperor looked at her intently and asked in all seriousness if she was always so trusting. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The emperor sighed heavily and said that she had agreed to his proposal without a second thought. A moment later she was taken aback and asked the emperor if they would go along the green path. He looked at her in surprise and said that it was exactly like that, but he did not understand how she understood this. She smiled and asked if it was not obvious. Layla said that the emperor himself said that he needed some plant. She looked at her closely and asked where else to look for it, if not on the green path. He sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. She looked at him intently and said that she really hoped he would find what he came for. He looked at her intently and asked if he was planning something bad, for example, if he wanted to kill someone. The young lady was taken aback and looking at the emperor said that he was now talking some nonsense. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really trusted him. When they first met, she was a little nervous, but now she understood everything. The young lady looked at the emperor intently and calmly said that she trusted him. The emperor froze in surprise as he had not expected to hear anything like this from her. He was amazed as no one had ever said anything like this to him before. She started to understand the seeds a few years ago. The year before, there was little rain, and it could not help but worry. As expected, there was a terrible drought, but they needed to supply supplies for the war. They were saved by the fact that they had stocked up on grain in advance, but they were tired of constantly worrying about food. Then the young lady found it. The emperor looked at her with a smile and said that this plant grows even in deserts. She looked at the emperor intently and said that of course she agreed to help him, but in fact she didn't know that much. He smiled and looked at the young lady and said that her knowledge was more than enough. He looked at her intently and said with a beaming smile that he was very glad that she went with him. Layla froze in embarrassment and couldn't utter a word when she saw his smile. She looked away from him in embarrassment as she understood that he was saying such things out of politeness. A moment later she looked at one necklace with a look of surprise. She looked at him intently, because for some reason this pendant was familiar to her. She froze for a moment and wondered if someone had worn it at the banquet. The emperor looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if there was something she liked. She was taken aback and said that it was not so. He looked at her closely with a smile on his face as he realized that she liked it. The emperor looked at the young man closely and asked if he could show them the pendant. The young man smiled and told the emperor that he had very good taste since the pendant had a magic stone. They looked at this necklace in surprise. The young man smiled and said that this pendant has special power and is a real rarity. The emperor looked at the young man in surprise and asked what the pendant did. The young man smiled and said that he would show them everything now. The emperor looked at the seller in surprise and asked what was about to happen. A moment later, the young man was beaming with power. He smiled and said that it was simply amazing. He said with a smile that he could change any part of his body. He looked at the young lady closely and said that this was very powerful magic. She smiled and said that it was exactly like that. The emperor looked at the young man intently and said that he was a useless and public ear. The young lady smiled and said that she didn't know if it was magic or something else, but the pendant was very beautiful. He looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she liked it. The young man smiled and said that the color was simply wonderful. The emperor looked at her and asked if she wanted the pendant. She was taken aback and thanked the emperor, saying that she did not need it. She stared at the pendant as she felt like she had seen it somewhere. She thought for a moment as it must not be that important, since she did not remember. The young lady looked at the emperor intently and asked if he had found what he wanted. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he had not. Layla thought for a moment. She said that they both walked the largest store on the green path. He looked at her closely and with a smile said that they thought that was enough for today. The emperor thanked the young lady with a smile for coming with him. He said that he would certainly pay her for her help. She smiled and said that he did not need to do that at all, as she was glad that she could be of use to him. A moment later, the emperor handed her a small box. She looked at the box, surprised. Opening the box, she saw that medallion. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand when he managed to buy it and why he was giving it to her now. The emperor smiled and said that it was a gift for help. The young lady was taken aback and said that she had done nothing wrong. He looked at her with a smile and said that she should take it away as it was the emperor's order. The young lady was taken aback. She didn't understand what was wrong with him. A moment later, the young lady finally thanked the emperor. He looked at her with a smile. The emperor looked at the young lady intently and with a satisfied smile said that she was no longer apologizing. He said that she should remember and always say thank you. She looked at the emperor intently and in surprise and asked if this was also an order. The emperor thought for a moment and said that this was not so. A moment later he said with a smile that it was just a request. The young lady smiled and thanked him. He looked at her closely and noticed that she was grasping everything on the fly like a diligent student. A few minutes later, a young man approached the emperor and said that it was time for them to return. The emperor looked at the young lady with a smile and said goodbye to her. She looked at him intently and also said goodbye, but a moment later she asked if she really needed to say thank you. He smiled and said that it was a very interesting question. The emperor said that he would perhaps take his words back. The young lady apologized to the maid and said that she would take her to the capital some other time. The maid smiled and said that she had seen many interesting things today. The young lady said that she had only seen a green corpse today. The maid smiled and said that was enough for her. The maid looked at the lady intently and asked if she could ask her a question. The lady said that she was listening to her question. The maid asked if that gentleman was higher in status than her. The young lady looked at the maid intently and said that it was exactly like that, and he was the emperor. The maid breathed a sigh of relief, but a moment later she promised and screamed. She was shocked, did not expect that the young man he seemed and the emperor himself. She was trembling with fear, looking at her mistress and muttering something indistinctly. Layla looked closely at the maid and asked her to calm down. The maid was very strong, worried she did not know how to calm down, because she alone knew that the emperor was a murderer. The young lady looked at the maid with a stern and glaring look and told her to be quiet. She asked the maid if she really wanted them to be put in jail for slander. The maid, with tears in her eyes, asked for forgiveness and said that unfortunately she had lost her temper, but she would be more careful in the future. From rumors, the young lady knew that he was a bloody emperor who killed all family members to ascend to the throne, but now she understood perfectly well that he didn't look like a cold-blooded killer at all. She sighed heavily and became sad because she did not know what to believe. Some time later, the young lady returned to the estate. For a moment, she froze in surprise. She was very surprised and did not understand what was happening. The butler looked at the Dune lady and said that it was all about buying Madame Cécile. The young lady drooped for a moment as she knew that the girl was carrying the Duke's child, but calling her mistress was too much. Layla was against Cécile being addressed as well as her, but if she tried to object again, the girl would complain to the Duke again. She looked closely at all the gifts that were on the street and asked the butler if all of these were really for her. He sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that. The young lady was surprised and did not understand what the girl had bought. Layla slowly approached the outfits. She thought that the girl had bought the dress because she had few clothes. She knew that she would not need these outfits with such a waist anytime soon. She looked at the butler intently and asked him to give her the checks so she could look at them. The young lady was shocked by what she read as the checks were written down for various outfits, shoes, pendants, accessories. Layla was shocked as they spent this amount on the maintenance of the estate for 6 months. She sighed heavily and said that the young lady was simply crazy. She knew perfectly well that when the girl gave birth, everything would go out of fashion. She didn't understand what she was thinking about. The young lady sighed heavily as she understood perfectly well that this was now none of her business. Layla thanked the butler for giving her the documents and said that he could take them. The maid looked at her mistress intently and asked with a smile if she should take the books to her room. Layla was taken aback as she had completely forgotten about the books, and she told the maid to do so. The Duke approached the young lady and asked what it was all about. The maid got ahead of her mistress and said that she had the books that the young lady had bought. The Duke was surprised and did not understand why she needed so many books. Layla looked at him intently and said that she needed all the books. The maid was taken aback for a moment as the young lady had been very abrupt with the master. He looked at her in surprise and said that they had enough books to read. He asked if she had decided to return to her duties. She looked at him intently and firmly said that she did not intend to do this. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she needed the books then. The young lady in turn said that she wanted to prepare for the exam. He looked at her mockingly and said that the exam would be taken by the best minds of the empire. He asked if she really thought that she would be able to pass the exam. Layla looked at him intently and said that she wouldn't know unless she tried. He looked at her with a grin and said that she had a lot of self-confidence. He looked at her intently and said that he would like to give her some advice. With a sly smile, he said that she did not need to waste her time on it. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she would decide for herself how to spend her time. He sighed heavily and said that she was stubborn. He looked at her mockingly and said that he was sure that she would never give him up for anything in her life. She looked at him intently and asked what would happen if she passed the exam. The Duke shouted that in that case he would fulfill her one wish. He looked at her intently and said that if she failed the exam, she would apologize to Cécile for everything she had done. The young lady was furious and wondered if the Duke was serious about telling her to apologize to the young lady. She sat intently and studied all the books. She knew perfectly well that she simply had to pass the exam. She was a little puzzled and wondered if she would be able to do it. The young lady was a little upset. She wondered if she was just taking unnecessary risks. Layla sighed heavily. She understood perfectly well that there was no turning back. She didn't want to let down the man who gave her a chance. She sighed heavily and said that she needed to give it her all. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said that they were returning to the estate tomorrow and asked her to tell them what things they needed to pack. Layla sighed heavily and said that she had already said that she would stay in the capital. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked what was the matter. Then, the maid was taken aback and said that it was the Duke's order. The young lady was shocked. She got ready with lightning speed and went to the Duke. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted something. She asked if they were really leaving for the estate tomorrow. The Duke said that everything was exactly like that, and they had already been delayed in the capital and needed to prepare for the rainy season. She looked at him intently and asked if something was wrong. She said that he could come back if he wanted, but she couldn't do that. She looked at him intently and said that there were only a few weeks left before the exam, and she wanted to stay in the capital and prepare for it. She said that she had no intention of wasting time on the road, and besides, if it rained, she would not be able to get to the capital. He sighed heavily and asked if she had forgotten that she had to explore the territory this weekend. The young lady thought for a moment and wondered if he was really talking about how she always conducted an inspection before the rainy season to see how her subjects were doing. She sighed heavily, as she knew that it had nothing to do with her now. She looked at him intently and asked if he really needed her help. He sighed heavily and said that he did not want to take her with him at all, but if he went alone, there might be disagreements with the magicians. She sighed heavily because she understood that in this case the reputation of the whole family and hers too would suffer. She sighed heavily and said that she would go. The Duke sighed heavily and said that she did not need to do this at all if she had her own business. He said angrily that he would be busy with the Duke's affairs, that he would not even go out. He said that they had not returned to the estate for a long time and a lot of work had accumulated. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that it would not be easy for him, but all she wished him was good luck. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really had nothing else to tell him. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked if she really had anything else to tell him. Moments later, he turned around angrily and said that he was leaving. She looked after him in bewilderment, but did not answer. Sometime later they arrived at the estate. The Duke sighed heavily when he saw a whole mountain of documents. He was puzzled and did not understand when there would be fewer of them. He tried to shift everything onto his bride, but it seemed that she did not understand the hints at all, and it was very hard for him. He sighed heavily because he understood that he did not need to expect anything from her at all. He wondered in confusion if she was capable of anything. A moment later, a young lady entered his room with a smile on her face. She looked at him intently and asked if he was tired. Cecile asked him with a smile if he needed help. The Duke looked at her with a smile and said that he did not expect to hear that from her at all. He looked at her intently and said that she didn't need to do that at all because she wasn't even a citizen of the Empire. The young lady looked at him with tears in her eyes and said that she really wanted to do that. He smiled and said that she was just wonderful. He smiled and said that if his bride was even half as kind as she was, it would be wonderful. The young lady in turn beamed with joy after what he said. A moment later, she took the document and approached him with a joyful smile, saying that with these documents she could definitely help him. The young lady looked at the maid and said that she did not need to worry, as she would finish inspecting the area and would return to the capital immediately. The young lady stood still for a moment near the carriage when she saw the Duke. Sometime later, they were riding together in the same carriage. He sighed heavily and said that he wanted to talk to her about something. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he wanted to talk about. Now she understood perfectly why he went with her and not with his mistress. He looked at her intently and said that he would like to talk to her about the preparations for the wedding. She froze for a moment as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her closely and asked what kind of cyst she had on her face. Now he asked if she had changed her mind about marrying him. She sighed heavily because she knew that she simply had to say no. She was taken aback as, for a moment, she seemed to be choking. The young lady timidly said that she did not expect to hear such a thing at all. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she had not expected to hear something like that, since he himself had said at the banquet that they would soon get married. He said that he wanted to have the wedding in October so that he could have time to do it before winter in their estate. He looked at her intently and asked what she would say to that. She sighed heavily and agreed with him, but thought to herself that it was too fast. She knew that the sooner she became a duchess, the better. The young lady understood that in this case she would stop worrying about her position. She sighed heavily and said that when they returned to the estate, she would start choosing a dress. A moment later, she heard her fiancé laugh. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that the bride should not prepare for the wedding herself. She sighed heavily and asked the groom who would help her. She asked if he was really suggesting the countess as her assistant. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that Cecile would be helping her. Layla froze in shock. He looked at her closely and said with a satisfied smile that the young lady said that she would be happy to help her, and after all she was a princess, so she understood such things better. The young lady in turn doubted that the former princess would help her with joy in preparing for the wedding. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked with a smile if something was wrong. Layla looked at him with fury and asked why Cecile would help her. A moment later, the Duke shouted angrily to the coachman to stop the carriage. With the speed of lightning, he got out of the carriage. He was angry. The young lady looked at him intently and calmly said that in the kingdom it seemed like mistresses could participate in the wedding preparations, but they lived in the empire. She looked at him with fury and said that she would be laughed at here if they found out that the preparations had been entrusted to her mistress. She said with fury that the countess would take care of everything. He shouted that she was an arrogant egotist. With lightning speed, the Duke burst into the carriage to his mistress. She looked at him with a smile and said that it seemed that everything had not gone very smoothly. The Duke sighed heavily and in a fit of anger said that everything was exactly like that. She understood perfectly well that there was no longer any time to delay and that it was necessary to drive a wedge between them. The young lady looked at her lover and asked if his fiancé did not respect him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady sighed heavily and asked her lover for forgiveness. She said that these were just her thoughts out loud and he should forget what she said. The Duke angrily told his lover that she was right. He shouted angrily that it was time for him to remind his bride where her place was. She looked at the Duke intently and said with a grin that he was right, because it was not at all proper for a countess to look down on a duke. She said that in her kingdom such a thing was simply not permissible. Sometime later, they arrived at the place. Everyone greeted the Duke with surprise. The man looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had a minute. She looked at the Baron in surprise. The young lady slowly walked closer to him and asked excitedly if something had happened. The Baron looked at her intently and said that he wanted to discuss something about the rainy season. Layla looked at him intently and said that it was no longer her concern and that he could discuss everything with the Duke. He said that of course he knew about it, but still wanted to hear her opinion. A moment later, the Duke came up to them and called the Baron. The Duke looked at the Baron intently and asked what he was talking about with the lady. The Baron was taken aback and looking at the Duke said that he only wanted to ask one question about preparing for the rainy season. The Duke looked at the defense in surprise and asked why he did not turn to him but turned to the young lady. The Duke looked at the Baron with fury and asked if he was also looking down on him. The young lady stood between them and asked the Duke to calm down a little. She said that the Baron simply wanted to ask for advice. The Duke looked at them with fury and asked if they really needed the advice of someone more experienced. He looked at them intently and said with anger that he would repeat it again. He told the Baron that he should not even think about discussing anything with the lady. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect such a thing. After a few days, she unfortunately still hadn't managed to talk to the Baron. She sighed heavily because she understood that even if this led to rumors of a disagreement with the Duke, she didn't care at all. The Duke looked at the man and asked if everything was to his satisfaction. The man looked at the Duke with a smile and thanked him. He said that preparations for the rainy season were in full swing. The young lady looked closely at the Duke as he seemed to care about his subjects more than she thought. She looked at him intently as if a weight had been lifted from her soul. Sometime later, a little boy came up to her and greeted her. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he wanted something. He looked at her intently and said that he wanted to tell her something. Layla was taken aback for a moment as she saw the Duke behind the little boy who was looking at them with a menacing look. The boy did not see the Duke behind him, and looking at the young lady asked if she could help them. The young lady looked at the little boy with a smile and said that she was not a lord at all. She smiled and said that the lord was standing right behind him. The boy turned around and looked at the Duke in surprise. He looked at the Duke in bewilderment. The Duke looked at the boy and forced out a semblance of a smile. The little boy looked at the young lady and said that she was the lord. He looked at her intently and said that she always took care of them. With lightning speed, the woman ran to her son. She was in shock, did not understand what he was saying. She looked at them intently and, taking her son, asked for forgiveness. She said that he was still too young and did not understand anything. She begged for forgiveness. The young lady looked at them intently. She is a woman and said that there was nothing to worry about. She said that they would definitely try to help them. The Duke looked angrily at the young lady and said that she seemed very tired. He said that she should return to the carriage and rest a little. He looked at her with fury and said that as the lord of these lands he would deal with the rest. Sometime later, they were riding quietly and silently in the carriage. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and asked calmly how everything had gone. He sighed heavily and said casually that it was none of her business. The young lady frowned but said nothing. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he would like to speak to her about the wedding. He looked at her intently and said that she had told him earlier that she was against Cecile helping with the preparations. Layla froze for a moment, wondering if he had decided to listen to her. He looked at his bride and said that for this reason he had called Countess Tebessa. The young lady was taken aback as she had not expected such a thing at all. He looked at her intently and asked with a grin if she wasn't happy. He said with a grin that she wanted it herself. The Duke said that she herself had said earlier that it would be better to have a countess than his beloved. The young lady looked at him intently. She knew he was just trying to piss her off. She knew he was being childish. Layla looked at him and said she had to leave early to study for her exam. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really not given up on this idea. She sighed heavily and said that she had not even thought about it. He looked at her in surprise and asked what would happen to the Duchess's duties if she passed the exam. The young lady said that she would sort everything out. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she seriously thought she would have time to do both. Layla looked at him in surprise and asked why he thought she wouldn't have time. He looked at her closely and sighed heavily and said that it seemed she did not understand that work in the administration was different from what she had done before. He said that the Emperor's workload would be many times greater. He looked at her intently and said angrily that she seemed to have forgotten something. The Duke looked at the young lady with anger and hatred and said that her job was to look after the estate, take care of him and their family, and also give birth to and raise children. He said with fury that if she neglected her duties, he would not leave it so easily. She sighed heavily because she knew that he was right after all. She understood perfectly well that the Duchess had told her the same thing, and then she had thought that it was all self-evident. She did not understand why, when she heard these words from him, everything inside her seemed to turn over. The young lady plopped down on the sofa because she was very tired. The maid looked closely at her mistress and asked with a smile if she had already finished her preparations for the wedding. Layla sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that, and only minor details remained, but she could deal with them from the capital and the Countess would take care of the rest. The Countess behaved as if she had already become the Duke's mother-in-law. All she did was give orders to everyone and just drag the young lady along with her. She sighed heavily as she understood that the Countess was meddling where she shouldn't have. She realized that although she could now concentrate on the exam, she was a little nervous as there was almost no time left. The young lady looked at the maid intently and said that she was returning to the capital tomorrow. The maid said with a smile that she would prepare everything for her return. Michelle looked at the young lady intently and asked if she liked the candy. Layla looked at her in surprise and asked why she was asking. Michelle smiled and said that she and the other maids had prepared some candy in the morning. Looking at the mistress, she asked if she wanted some sweets. The young lady smiled and thanked her. She tried one candy, and it was strawberry. She froze in place for a moment. The young lady remembered the moment when the Emperor treated her to candy. She remembered that he looked at her with a smile and said that when he was very sad he always ate strawberry candies. Then he said that he really hoped she felt better. She enjoyed the taste of the wonderful candies with a smile. They seemed very tasty to her. The maid looked at her mistress with a joyful smile and asked if she liked the candies, and also asked if she wanted some with a different flavor. Layla said with a smile that perhaps she had enough. Michelle asked with tears in her eyes if she didn't like candy. Layla smiled and said that wasn't the case. She said with a smile that she just likes the one with strawberries the most. The young lady looked closely at the maid and thanked her for the treat. She sighed heavily as she knew it was already very late and it was time for her to sleep. The young lady fell asleep with lightning speed, but unfortunately, in the middle of the night, she was awakened by a roar. She was shocked and wondered what all the noise was about in the middle of the night. With the speed of lightning, she ran to the window and opened it wide. The lady froze in shock as she realized that the rainy season had already begun. Layla looked at the man intently and asked if it would really not work. The man sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness. He said it was too dangerous. She sighed heavily and said that he was not guilty of anything at all, and he did not need to apologize at all. She sighed heavily because she understood that she could not argue with him here. She understood perfectly well that it was dangerous to go anywhere in such weather. She knew that many years ago the Duke and Duchess had died because of just such rain. The maid looked at the young mistress with concern and asked if she was really feeling ill. Layla looked at the man intently and asked when they could leave. He thought for a moment and said that he couldn't say for sure. He said he wouldn't tell her for sure, but not until a few days later. The young lady wondered for a moment how much time she had left. She sighed heavily as she knew she had little time and there was no other way out. She looked at the man and said that he should let her know when they could leave. She looked out the window and knew that several days had already passed. She was puzzled because she knew perfectly well that she would not be able to leave tomorrow. She was in shock because she had been nervous for several days, and she had a feeling that something bad was about to happen. A young man burst into her room and shouted that they were in trouble. She froze for a moment, and memories of that terrible day when the Duke and Duchess died came flooding back. She was taken aback and felt sick. She was out of breath and could not utter a word. The maid rushed to her with lightning speed, she called her, but the mistress did not answer. Michelle looked at the lady with alarm and asked if something had happened to her. She sighed heavily and said that she was fine. The young lady looked at the young man intently and asked what was wrong. He sighed heavily and said that the river had overflowed its banks. Layla looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. With the speed of lightning, she turned around and said that she was going to the Duke immediately. As she approached the Duke's office, she bumped into the Baron. The Baron was surprised as he did not expect to see her at all. She looked at him intently and said that she had been told that the river had overflowed its banks. She was agitated, looked at the defenses, and asked what the damage was. He hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, he looked closely at the young lady and said with regret in his voice that unfortunately, due to the river that had overflowed its banks, the rice fields were flooded with water and many residents were carried away by the current. She was shocked because she understood that since people were hurt, they needed to do something urgently. Entering the office, she saw the Duke and his subordinates. They were saying that if they did not do anything now, they would be left without a harvest. They were shouting at the Duke that they needed to act immediately. They were saying that they were waiting for orders from him. The Duke said that they needed to restore the shore, but a moment later he heard someone's voice. The young lady entered the Duke's office with the speed of lightning together with the Baron. He looked at her with fury and asked what she forgot in his office. Layla looked at him intently and asked if it was important. Now she looked at him with anger and said that what was important now was to prevent damage. She shouted angrily that the rains were still not stopping, and if they started to restore the riverbank, they would only make things worse. She glared at the Duke and shouted that they needed to evacuate everyone quickly. He looked at her with fury and asked what they should do with the crops. The young lady was shocked and shouted that the fields could be replanted, but people could not be brought back to life. She looked at the Lord intently and shouted for him to gather the guards as they had to save the people immediately. The Lord told the lady that he understood her and to do everything immediately. She looked at her subordinates intently and said that they would need all the carriages and coachmen. She said that they would need to lead those who were unable to walk on their own. She looked at the maid and told her to prepare a place in the outbuilding and bring doctors there to take care of the wounded. The maid said that she would do everything immediately. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she was willing to accept punishment later for disobeying the order, and if anything went wrong, all responsibility would fall on her. She looked at the Duke intently and asked him to show his generosity and allow them to save the people first. The Duke in turn froze in place from shock and bewilderment. Sometime later, all the rescued people were sitting in the perestroika. They said that the lady had sent carriages for them. They hoped that she would soon become their duchess. They hoped that she would always take care of them. They were surprised and did not understand why the river overflowed its banks. The men looked at each other. They were puzzled by this question. The man looked closely at his friends and said that the Lord was preparing for this rainy season. The man said that the Lord had threatened the lady and had forbidden her to interfere in the affairs of the duchy. They were shocked because they now understood what was going on. They understood that the new Lord did not understand anything. They understood perfectly well that he should have relied on their mistress since she knew a lot, and was very smart. They said that she should be the one in charge of everything here. The men said that everything was fine with them while the Lord was at war. The young man approached the Duke and quietly told him everything he had learned. The Duke was furious. He did not understand how the young lady dared to do such a thing. The young lady looked at the Baron in surprise and asked why the budget had been cut this year. The Baron sighed heavily and said that this was exactly what the Duke had decided. The Baron looked at the young lady and said that the Duke had forbidden him to tell her this. The Baron asked for forgiveness. The young lady was taken aback and told the Baron that it was not his fault. The young lady looked at the Baron and said that the Duke had to sign the documents in accordance with the new budget. A moment later, the Baron handed her the documents. She was shocked as she realized that the Duke did not hire magicians and fortify the river banks. She looked at the defense in surprise and asked if the Duke didn't know that there was a lot of quan in the river. The Baron sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that the Duke told him that there was also quan in other rivers and there was nothing to worry about. She knew that even the former Duke did not know about this, since she accidentally stumbled upon this information when she was analyzing the cause of the drought. It turned out that the quan was destroying the Amen, so she strengthened the shore with Doris stone. She understood that it was very expensive, but she knew that there was no other choice. She was in shock, since she understood that now the damage was several times greater than the cut budget. The young lady looked intently at the Baron and asked where the Duke was now. She understood perfectly well that for the sake of the future of the inhabitants, she had to talk to the Duke immediately. The young lady in turn did not hesitate and went to the Duke. She looked at him intently and called out. The Duke casually asked what she wanted. The young lady said she had a question for him regarding preparations for the rainy season. She said she wanted to talk to him about why he hadn't hired the mages and fortified the riverbank. He sighed heavily and asked what was wrong with that. The young lady looked at him and said that he should know that the river was on their land. He didn't let her finish and looked at her with fury. He asked what she had just said. He asked if she had said that the river was on their land. She looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand why he was making a noise. He looked at her with anger and said that she was not yet his wife. He looked at her intently and asked with anger, since when this was their land. He pushed her away and threw the documents out of her hands. The Duke shouted angrily that this was his land. He shouted that he had already told her that the Duke's work did not concern her. He asked angrily why she continued to interfere in such a thing. She started telling him about the people who had fallen victim to the rain. He shouted that it seemed like she was just trying to prove that she was better than him. He shouted that it seemed like she wanted to show everyone that she was better at his job. The young lady was taken aback and shouted that it was not so. He shouted that she had no shame at all. He did not understand how she dared to spread all sorts of rumors about him. She looked at him in surprise and asked what rumors he was talking about. The Duke looked at her with fury and said that he was warning her for the last time. As he left, he said that she should mind her own business. He said that if she disobeyed again and did things her way, he would have to take action. She wondered if he hadn't warned her again, if this time really was the last, how she would have reacted. The young lady stood quietly at the window and watched the weather intently. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that she had heard that after this incident, the villagers began to compare her to the Duke. She sighed heavily and said that there were those people who would prefer her to the Duke. She sighed heavily, for she now understood that the Duke had decided that it was she who had spread such rumors. She was very sad, for she did not understand how they had lost all her trust in each other. She was shocked and didn't understand why he wanted to get married as soon as possible. She sighed heavily because she understood that now it made no difference. She understood perfectly well that the exam was coming soon, and this was her chance to change everything. The young lady looked at the young man closely and asked if there was a free carriage. The young man sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry, but there was none. He said that all the carriages were involved in the evacuation. He looked closely at the young lady and said that there was only one left, but since it was harmful to walk during pregnancy, the Duke and the lady had taken her. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. She understood that there were only 5 days left until the exam. She understood perfectly well that if she wanted to make it before the exam began, then she needed to urgently send it right now. She looked excitedly at the young man and shouted that she could go in the cart. He looked timidly at the lady and asked for forgiveness, saying that unfortunately all the carts were busy. The maid looked at the young lady with concern and asked if everything was really that bad. Layla was in shock and didn't know what to do now. Bear looked at the emperor intently and informed him how many people had come for the exam. The emperor looked at him intently and said with a smile that it seemed to him that his assistant was dissatisfied with something. The young man cried out and said that he was certainly dissatisfied since he was not allowed to go home. He looked at the emperor with a keen gaze and asked if he would be free after the exam. The emperor smiled and said that it was exactly like that, but he should not forget to return to work even if he did not want to do so. The emperor looked intently at the lists that his assistant handed him. The emperor thought for a moment as he did not see the name of the young lady on the lists. His assistant looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really talking about the Duke's bride. Bear was a little surprised and did not understand why the emperor was interested in the young lady. He said that the exam would involve the best experts in a variety of fields. He looked at the emperor closely and said that perhaps she was just scared. The emperor thought for a moment. He sighed heavily and thought about the young lady, for he knew perfectly well that she was not like that at all. For a while he sat in silence and looked over the lists. The young man looked at the emperor with concern and asked if he should find out why the young lady had not come to the exam. The emperor sighed heavily and said that they should not do that. He said that they would not have time to find out anything before the exam started anyway, and there was no point in doing so after. The young man sighed heavily and said that the exam would begin in half an hour. He looked intently at the emperor and said that in that case he would go into the hall. The emperor stood up and said that he would also go into the hall. Bear looked at the emperor intently and asked if he really wanted to attend the exam in person. The emperor asked in bewilderment if he really couldn't do that. The young man said that of course it was possible, but the examinees might get nervous when they saw the emperor in front of them. The emperor in turn said that in that case they were not suitable for the position of his assistant. The young man sighed heavily. He understood that the emperor had very high standards, and at this rate they would not be able to find anyone. A moment later he opened the office and asked the emperor to come in. Everyone froze in surprise looking at the emperor, as they did not expect to see him at all. With the speed of lightning, all those present greeted the emperor. The emperor looked intently at everyone present. He sighed heavily as he realized that, as he had expected, there was not a single woman in the room. There was no clause in the imperial law prohibiting women from holding public office. But since there had never been a single case in history where everyone thought it was forbidden, the emperor was a little puzzled and wondered why the young lady had given up so easily. The young man looked at everyone present and said that the exam would begin in a few minutes. He asked everyone present to take their seats. He looked at the emperor and asked if he could close the door. The emperor, excited, looked at him and asked how much time they had left. Bear sighed heavily and said that they only had 1 minute left. The emperor was a little puzzled and upset, as he knew that the young lady would not come to the exam after all. He sighed heavily and told his assistant to close the door. But a moment later, they heard a female voice. The young lady was shouting in a hurry and asking them to wait and not close the door. The emperor froze in shock and surprise on the spot. A moment later, a young lady ran into the room. With lightning speed, she introduced herself. She shouted that she had come for an exam. For a while, the young lady stood surrounded by men breathing heavily. The young man looked closely at the young lady. He saw that she was in a great hurry and was dressing in a hurry. He slowly approached the young lady and called her by name. She looked at him intently and replied that everything was correct and she had come to take the exam. Everyone froze in place. They were surprised that she was going to take the exam. They did not understand why the future Duchess needed to take an exam. They heard that there were some rumors in their family. Someone said that it looked like she was the illegitimate daughter of a count. The Emperor slammed his fist on the table in anger and shouted for everyone to be quiet. He looked at them with fury and said that the exam was already underway, so there should be no talking. With lightning speed, all the young people dispersed and took their places. The young lady looked sideways at the young man and asked if she could participate if she was late. He smiled and said that it was okay and she could participate. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that her exam was about to start and asked her to sit down. They whispered and said that she was the only woman and also a future duchess. They said that she would not pass the exam anyway. They said that she probably hadn't received a proper education. The young people said that the exam would be the hardest in history, so the result was obvious. The Emperor looked at his assistant in surprise and asked if the young lady had done the best job. The young man looked at the Emperor with a smile and said that everything was exactly like that. The Emperor was surprised. He knew, of course, that she was very smart, but he did not expect that her result would be the best. He looked at his assistant and told him to show him her answers immediately. Bear looked at the Emperor intently and said that the committee had praised the young lady so much that they were almost hoarse. The Emperor looked closely at her answers. He was surprised as her answers were simply excellent. He looked closely at his assistant and said that these answers were simply amazing. He was surprised because he knew that it was not at all easy to give such a detailed answer in such a short time, but the young lady did an excellent job. Bear looked at the Emperor with joy and asked if she could handle the pile of paperwork too. He looked at the Emperor intently and said that in that case he could give her to him. The Emperor was taken aback and looking at his assistant asked what he was talking about. The Emperor looked at his assistant in bewilderment and said that the young lady was not some kind of thing at all. The young man was taken aback and said that he seemed to have expressed himself incorrectly. Bear looked at the Emperor intently and said that he only meant that he wanted to appoint her as his assistant as soon as possible. He said that he wanted to see such talent in action as soon as possible. The Emperor sighed heavily and said with a smile that it seemed to him that his assistant wanted to dump his work on someone else as soon as possible. The Emperor looked at the assistant and asked where the young lady was now, as he would like to talk to her personally. Bear looked at the Emperor and said that the young lady was already waiting for him downstairs. The Emperor was surprised as he had not expected such a thing. The young man smiled and said that he thought that when the Emperor saw the young lady's work, he would definitely want to talk to her. He looked at the Emperor with a smile and said that for this reason he asked the young lady to stay a little longer. The Emperor looked at his assistant with a smile and said that he was simply great. The young lady in turn was a little puzzled and surprised. She did not understand why she was told to stay in the palace. The Emperor slowly approached the young lady and said with a smile that she looked wonderful. She sheepishly asked the Emperor for forgiveness for showing up for the exams in such an inappropriate manner. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry at all as everything was fine. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that the judge could tell from her appearance that something was wrong with her. He looked at her intently and asked if she would tell him everything that had happened. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She knew that it was better for her not to say that she and the Duke had quarreled. She knew very well that such things should not be spread around. She sighed heavily and said that it just so happened that all the carriages were busy preparing for the rainy season, and she was lucky that some traders were passing by. She sighed heavily and said that they gave her a ride to the capital. The Emperor looked at her in surprise and asked if there really wasn't even a cart. He told the young lady that she could have just ridden on horseback. The young lady looked at the Emperor with embarrassment and said that she was extremely embarrassed to admit it, but unfortunately she did not know how to ride a horse. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really not been taught as a child. She sighed heavily and said that it just happened that way. She knew that the Countess had not taught her anything, and she had learned the alphabet with difficulty on her own. The emperor looked at the young lady closely. He smiled and said that whatever the case, she had done well on the exam. He looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she had the best result. Layla looked at him in surprise and asked if this was true. She was taken aback and said that it was simply impossible and that there must have been some mistake. He looked at her intently and asked if she really meant to say that the commission, Bear, and the emperor himself were wrong. She consoled him, not knowing what to answer. He looked at the young lady intently and said that that was why he had decided to appoint her as his assistant. The young lady was shocked and couldn't even believe it. Layla wondered if she would really become the emperor's assistant. The emperor looked at the young lady with a radiant smile and congratulated her on her new position. With tears in her eyes, she thanked him. Layla was surprised and at the same time happy because she had done it. She had long dreamed of getting rid of all the prejudices that women have no place in government service. She was shocked because now she would become the emperor's assistant. She stood frozen in surprise for a moment and wondered if the duke would allow her to do something like that. The emperor looked at the young lady intently and called her with a smile on his face. She was taken aback and asked for forgiveness as she was a little lost in thought. He smiled and said that he understood it. Layla slowly rose and sadly said that she should first return to the estate. The emperor looked at her closely and said with a smile that everything was correct, since she needed to pack her things. She sighed heavily and said that she still needed to ask the duke's permission. The emperor looked at her in surprise and asked why she needed to do that. He said that it was her life and it was up to her to decide what to do. She sighed heavily and timidly said that he was her fiancé. The emperor looked at her intently and asked what was wrong with that. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand why he was saying such a thing. She looked at the emperor intently and wondered if that wasn't enough of an answer for him. The emperor looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked if the duke ever asked her permission when he was going to do something. She sighed heavily and said that he never asked anything. She understood perfectly well that her fiancé always did as he wanted. And unfortunately, she then had to defend him. Callian looked at her and asked why he didn't ask her since she was his fiancée. She thought for a moment about what the emperor had asked. She wondered if it was possible because he was a duke. She was puzzled because she knew that the duke's father always respected his wife's opinion. She knew he didn't have to, but it just came naturally to him. She realized that the duke had never taken her opinion into account. She was surprised and puzzled and wondered why she realized this only now. She sighed heavily because she knew perfectly well that she had always known this. She just didn't want to admit it. The emperor looked at her intently and with a gentle smile asked if she was really overcome by different thoughts. Now Layla looked at the emperor intently and asking for forgiveness said that she promised to be collected. The emperor looked at her intently and asked if they would see each other again. She thought for a moment, not knowing what to answer him. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she would have enough months to go to the estate. Layla looked at him with a smile and said that this amount of time would be enough for her and also thanked him for his understanding. He looked at her intently and with a radiant smile said that it was just a trifle since she would still help him in many ways in the future. He came closer to her and quietly said that he would accept any decision she made. The young lady froze for a moment in embarrassment. He looked at her intently and said that she should know that he really needed her help. She was surprised as he came very close to her. He said with a radiant smile that he would definitely wait for her return. The young lady thought for a moment. She knew that she had been lent a dress and a carriage. She understood perfectly well that she would have to thank the emperor. Layla rode and thought the whole way about how she should thank the emperor. She knew that he had a lot of different goods. She remembered him saying with a smile and tenderness that he really needed her help. She understood perfectly well that the only way to repay his kindness was to agree to become an assistant. Some time later, the coachman told his mistress that they had already arrived. The young lady was confused. She did not know what the duke would say to this. The maids ran up to their mistress joyfully. They were glad that she had returned. The young lady smiled and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. She also asked how they were doing without her. The maid smiled and said that they were slowly restoring the lands. The maid looked at the mistress with a smile and said that she heard that the young lady passed the exam and got the best result. Layla smiled and said that she was just lucky. They spoke with joy and with tears in their eyes, that luck had nothing to do with it. She was just very smart. The young lady said sheepishly that it was just a trifle. A moment later, the Duke approached them and looked at Layla with fury. He looked at her with fury and said that he congratulated her because she had passed the exam after all. He said angrily that he had not thought that she would do better than anyone else. She sighed heavily because she understood that she would not see anything new now. She understood that he was in a bad mood again. She looked closely at the Duke. Of course, she did not hope that he would share the joy of victory with her, but he could at least not be rude. He looked at the young lady with fury and asked if she had really decided to become an assistant. Layla looked at him intently and calmly said that perhaps she would do so. He looked at her with fury and asked if she would not even ask his permission. He looked at her with a ducal fury and anger and asked if she had forgotten that he was her fiancé. She sighed heavily and said that he in turn had never asked her permission. He looked at her with surprise and nonchalance and asked if he really had to do that. The young lady was shocked and shouted that they were engaged. She screamed that his father always took the Duchess's opinion into account. He looked at her with a grin and asked if she was upset again that he was taking care of Cecile. She was shocked. I didn't understand what this had to do with it. He looked at her with a grin and said that she was the mistress of the estate, but if she still wanted to become an assistant, then he simply had no other choice. He shouted angrily and said that she should get away. Layla looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke shouted angrily that he had just told her to get lost. The maid looked at her mistress with tears in her eyes, as she felt very sorry for her Layla. In turn wondered if he had really decided to kick her out. The maid came closer to the lady and said that she must tell the Duke that she had simply made a mistake. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand what she had done wrong. She looked closely at everyone present and asked if she had been wrong, in that thanks to her efforts, she had received the position of assistant to the emperor. Layla understood perfectly well that kicking her out of the estate was tantamount to breaking up. She looked at the Duke intently, for she knew that he had achieved his goal. She looked at him with fury, and the Duke was taken aback. A moment later, she shouted that there would be no wedding.